Marking up our fourth bill for the 2015 fiscal year, Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development. We have an excellent clip as we're working very rapidly. As you've heard, this is the earliest ever that we've done these bills. So I thank you for your hard work. And we're going to continue this work as we move on so that we'll do all the bills during our allotted time. Now, this is going to be a busy couple of weeks for the committee. In addition to today's action, we approved our Ag bill in subcommittee yesterday. And moving into next week, I just want to give you a little advance warning. We've got to fit in a week's worth of work into 3 days. That'll entail moving at least 3 more bills through either subcommittee or full committee, plus CJS on the floor at the same time. So get ready. And do your breathing exercises, Mr. Moran. Now, we want to turn to Chairman Latham for the fiscal 2015 Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development Appropriations Bill. As you know, our friend and colleague from Iowa is moving to greener pastures come January, and we're going to miss him on this committee especially. I've served with Tom on subcommittees going back to the 80s? In the mid-90s. And always a level head and a good turn about him. I've relied upon him for information and wisdom and guidance all these years, as have you, and we're going to miss that here. He's the real thing. So, Tom, we're going to miss you on this committee, and we wish for you a great, great future. And you're now recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for those kind words. And greener pastures, I'm not sure what. Does that mean I have a job someplace? I don't. Apparently, I don't think so. But again, thank you for the opportunities that you've given me and the great friendship that we've had and to the honor to serve on this great committee. I really want to thank everyone here. The bill before us today meets our allocation of $52.029 billion, which is an increase of $1.17 billion over the 2014 enacted levels, and that's the good news. The bad news is the FHA receipts are down almost $3 billion from last year. That doesn't mean that FHA is going broke. It's just that CBO estimates that more home buyers are financing or refinancing their homes through the private market rather than through FHA. It's a scoring quirk has brought us some challenges in the bill, but we're determined to live by our budget deal that was struck last year. Like appropriators do, we made choices and set priorities. The bill before you recommends funding levels to keep the FAA air traffic controllers and safety inspectors on the job, and proposes some increases for safety programs, especially to address the challenges we're seeing in hazardous materials and railroads. This bill provides sufficient funds to keep all families currently receiving housing assistance under the umbrella of the various HUD programs. We recommend funding the base CDBG program at $3 billion, which is almost the level of last year. For the surface programs, we provide funding level with fiscal year 2014, and it's consistent with the last year of MAP 21. It's contingent upon reauthorization. I know I don't need to remind any of you about the balances in the Highway Trust Fund, and I'm hopeful the authorizers will come up with a plan to bring these critical programs into 2015. The budget proposed and assumed a lot of new authorizing for this year, both in DOT and HUD, and we did carry some of those provisions last year. However, a whole new surface program and pages of new HUD legislation are best left to the authorizers for their evaluation and judgment, so we have not included in the bill. I believe we struck a good balance between housing and transportation. The various provisions members asked us to consider were considered very seriously. The beauty of the regular order and open process is members and the public are able to see the bill and proposed amendments beforehand. I very much appreciate Chairman Rogers and Ranking Member Lowy's commitment to bringing these bills forward under regular order. And again, I want to thank Chairman Rogers and Ranking Member Lowy for their support of this bill and the process. I'd like to thank the members of the subcommittee who worked very, very hard throughout this season, and for your support and everything that you do, and all the bills and amendments that I've had I've sponsored over the years. In no other committee do we have the opportunity year after year to make a difference for the families and communities that we all represent. And I thank you for everything you've done to help me, help the people of Iowa, and to help the people of this nation. I cannot present this without saying a special thank you to the great professional staff that we have, certainly led by Dina and Kate on the minority side. They've worked as a team all the way through, and it's been a real pleasure. And finally, I have to thank my good friend, the ranking member, Ed Pastor. It's been a real honor and privilege, and we've had a lot of fun along the way also. Those of you that have had the honor of working with Ed know he's an honest broker, a true advocate for Arizona, a man who appreciates the humor of what comes our way at times, right, Ed? And I'm very, very fortunate to have a good friend. We were good friends before we got in this mess, right, Ed? And but a great member, a great friend, and I sincerely appreciate that you're able to work together. We need to get this bill to the floor. Ranking Member Pastor and I have a manager's amendment to make some technical and requested changes to the bill. And the bill before you is a solid product. I think that's worthy of everyone's support. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Let me echo and reverberate your comments on Ed Pastor. He's a pro. As you say, he's got a great sense of humor and doesn't take himself too seriously, and is a hard worker and a great devotee of this committee and this institution. It's sad that we're going to miss him as well next year. And we wish for Ed, let's see, can you wish for greener pastures in Arizona? Anyway, what a great human being, Ed Pastor.
Hey. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much for your comments, but hopefully next year through the energy and water bill we can have more water for Arizona, and then we'll have greener pastures. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Rogers. Good morning, members of the Appropriations Committee. First of all, I want to thank Chairman Latham for the work on this bill. As he mentioned, we have been friends for many years, and before we became ranking and chair of this committee, and so I thank him for his friendship, and we really enjoyed working together the last few years. And I thank him for all the courtesies he extended to me and the friendship he has given me. So thank you very much, Chairman Latham. As the Chairman told you, the allocation for the Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development bill is nearly $1.2 billion higher than the fiscal year 2014 enacted level. But he also told us that due to the sharp difference between OMB and CBO's receipt estimate for the FHA loan program, this bill is actually $1.8 billion lower than fiscal year 2014. As a result, the bill before us today freezes many programs at last year's level. Deeper cuts were made to Amtrak, grants for new transit systems, HUD's home program, and HUD's program to reduce the hazards of lead and other household toxins. I am hopeful that we will be able to address some of these shortfalls as the bill moves through the process. I want to commend Chairman Latham for ensuring that the bill addresses the important safety functions of the Department of Transportation. In particular, I am pleased that the bill will allow the Federal Aviation Administration to continue to hire new controllers, advance the modernization of the air traffic control system, and fully funds the authorized level for airport grants. The CDBG, Community Development Block Grant Program, is adequately funded, and the Chairman worked to ensure that tenants in assisted housing will retain their housing. I also want to thank the Chairman for working with us on the Manager's Amendment that he will offer in a few moments. This is not a perfect bill, but with a better conference allocation, I am hopeful that we will produce a bill that we all can support. I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Is there other general discussion? I'm sorry, Ms. Lloyd.
I knew you'd get around to it, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much. And I, too, want to join you in thanking Chairman Latham and Ranking Member Pastor for your service on this committee and to our country. I know that you are smiling a great deal these days, and you will both have an opportunity, I am sure, to go on to the next phase of your life. So lots of good luck, and we appreciate your service. And I do want to thank Mr. Latham and Mr. Pastor for including language in the manager's amendment that designates some unexpended funds at the FRA for activities related to improving the rail transport of energy products like crude oil. I really do appreciate the efforts of the chairman and ranking member to put this bill together. That I know they worked so collegially and effectively together. Their job was made all the more difficult by a much lower than expected FHA and Ginnie Mae receipts. Unfortunately, the investments in this bill aren't enough to maintain the country's highway and transit infrastructure. I'm specifically concerned about cuts to the following critical programs. Amtrak's capital funding is decreased by $200 million below FY14. This is very serious because it will defer critical repairs. Capital investment grants, which support new subway, light rail, and commuter projects, are $809 million below the request, and the bill contains no funding for transit projects that are in the pipeline. Tiger would receive a paltry $100 million. While I am pleased the majority included it in its bill for the first time, the proposed level is insufficient. And on the housing side, both home and the Public Housing Capital Fund, which are vital for the rehabilitation and modernization of our country's affordable housing stock, face sharp decreases. At $700 million, home is funded at its lowest level since the program began in 1992. And the Public Housing Capital Fund is funded below the sequester level. Additionally, I'm disappointed that funding wasn't included to support the installation of positive train control. On this point, Congressman Quigley and I plan to offer an amendment. I hope my colleagues will support it. And while we were able to provide a slight increase for the transport of energy products at the FRA in the manager's amendment, and additional resources at Pipeline Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, for research and development to improve training and outreach efforts related to incident response for oil and gas accidents, I really wanted this committee to fully support the President's new Safe Transportation of Energy Products Fund for prevention and response activities across all agencies at DOT that are grappling with the dangers of transport of crude oil. Communities across the country, including many in my district, live in fear of another train derailment like the one that occurred in Quebec. Last July, and this committee has a duty, a responsibility to fully fund initiatives to make transport of these materials safer. That said, I am deeply appreciative that the chairman did work with me to include report language urging DOT to take a multifaceted, comprehensive approach to the oversight of crude oil. This language specifically directs the Pipeline Hazardous Materials Safety Administration to update emergency spill response planning thresholds, improve training protocols unique to crude oil and ethanol incident responses, and finalize a rule improving safety standards for crude oil tank cars by the end of September. I would be remiss if I didn't note my objection to the inclusion of riders on California high-speed rail and on truck weight exemptions. These riders will be controversial and will only hinder the bill's progress through the Congress. It is my sincere hope that we can continue to work together, that we can improve this bill as the process moves forward, and I urge the Senate Appropriations Committee to include appropriate levels for extremely important programs that were underfunded in this bill. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
This bill focuses $52 billion discretionary funding on the infrastructure that grows the American economy and on the housing programs that protect our most vulnerable citizens. All of these investments are important to our economic growth, important to the safety of our citizens, and important to those people who might worry about whether or not they will have a roof over their head tomorrow. But we must also be mindful of the limited funding we have in our federal coffers today, and the debt we risk putting on the backs of our children and grandchildren if we spend beyond our means and if we continue to multiply our mandatory requirements. The bill before you today strikes a fine balance between fiscal restraint, careful investment in our nation's transportation infrastructure, and economic well-being. It rejects the administration's attempt to move highway programs to the mandatory side of the ledger, where it would exacerbate an already unsustainable rate of spending. And it finds responsible places to trim funding so that we can direct needed taxpayer dollars to the programs that will do the most good. The bill totals $1.2 billion more than last year's enacted level, but taking technical adjustments into account, it is more accurately described as $1.8 billion below the current level. This is because we're facing a substantial decline in Federal Housing Administration receipts, which offsets some of the spending in this bill. The improvement of our nation's transportation infrastructure is one of our chief priorities. So we've provided nearly $40.25 billion from the Highway Trust Fund, same level as this year, for these programs. But as you know, this funding relies on our colleagues on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee devising a way to address the challenges facing the Highway Trust Fund before this summer and the enactment of new transportation authorization legislation. We've also made sure that full funding is provided for all FAA air traffic control personnel, as well as FAA's next generation air transportation systems, which will help keep air travel running smoothly now and into the future. We've rejected the administration's proposals that would impose new passenger facility and general aviation fees. Safety is also a priority of this committee, so this bill increases funding for a variety of transportation safety programs that affect not just roads and airways, but waterways and pipelines. Within the Department of Housing and Urban Development, we've increased funding for public and Indian housing by $6.2 million. This will ensure that all those currently served by the program continue to receive assistance. And we fully funded the President's request for veterans housing vouchers. Other housing programs maintain level funding that will continue assistance to all those currently served. There's always more to do, but I believe this bill makes the absolute most with what it has, using a reasonable, fiscally responsible allocation to help prepare the country for future economic growth, shore up our transportation infrastructure, keep our skies safe and efficient, and provide housing for those in dire need. So this is a smart step in the right direction, and I urge my colleagues to support the bill. Is there further discussion in a general sense? Ms. Capter.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to take a moment to say that I've had the great privilege of serving with both Mr. Latham and Mr. Pastor for their entire careers. And I think what is remarkable about both of them is their spirit of service and their honorable service. We've gone through some difficult times here in the Congress, and in the end, we're a very human institution. And I wanted to say for the record that I shall miss the steak dinners from Iowa, where Tom worked so hard to bring us together, both sides of the aisle, for the younger members on our committee and for some of the younger people listening. That spirit is very, very important to this institution functioning. If you never had a green corn enchilada from Arizona, you don't know what you missed. But both Ed and Tom did something beyond what ordinary members do in order to build a spirit of collegiality so we could actually talk to one another. And I think that their senses of humor helped us all. You might not have thought so, but it made it easier to get through the day. And you respected this committee. You were for governance, not shutdowns. And the traditions of this committee are extraordinarily important to a stable nation. And so I just wanted to thank both of you for elevating us as a committee and as an institution. I will miss you both very much. Thank you for your honorable sense of service. And I will end with this story. When I was first elected and came here as a very green member, one of only 24 women out of 435, I can remember going up to a member, I won't tell you which side of the aisle he was on, and I said, I'd really like to ask for your support on a measure. I wasn't on the Appropriations Committee then. And he kind of, okay, and I took that as a yes. And when he voted against me, I said, wait a minute, you said you would be with me. He said, oh, I said I'd support you. I never said I'd vote for you. So I learned a raw lesson early on. I can definitely say that Tom Latham and Ed Pastor were not that kind of member. And our country was bettered by their service, and it has been a real joy to work with you. God bless you both. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Sarno.
Mr. Chairman, I have a couple of comments to make, but before I do that, I want to join also my colleagues in saying how much we will miss Mr. Latham and Mr. Pastor. Mr. Latham is one of the friendliest people that you'll meet in this Congress, and those of you who are new to the Congress are going to miss someone who you didn't get to know as I did, a real leader, and as Ms. Capter said, always trying to find a bipartisan approach. And so I'm going to miss him a lot, and when I decide to run for president, maybe we'll see each other as the first stop over there. Mr. Pastor is a man who confused me. When I first met him, I thought he was the toughest guy I had ever met. And then I found out he was the nicest, sweetest guy in the world. And the reason I thought he was the toughest guy was, you don't know this, but he used to carry a jalapeno pepper in a little baggie in his pocket. And before a snack, a lunch, a dinner, a drink of water, he would bite into it and eat it. Now, I like hot food, but that's ridiculous. I mean, the fumes used to drive me crazy. I would cry, and people wonder, why is this guy always crying? It was around Pasteur, you know? And so, Ed, you later totally confused me by being such a nice guy. We're going to miss both of you, and I assure you that you and Tom Latham were not on the list of people that some of us would like to leave. I assure you that. You know. On an issue, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to discuss concerns with the HUD bill. First, the Public Housing Capital Fund, which has seen drastic cuts in recent years, cutting funding by more than $70 million for New York City's Housing Authority alone, NYCHA, capital fund. Public housing authorities across the country have significant capital needs, and a further reduction in funding is unsustainable. NYCHA has an estimated backlog of $6 billion in unmet capital needs, which is estimated to increase to $13 billion within the next 4 years. NYCHA's 2014 capital fund allocation is approximately $258 million. This is a 39% reduction in funding from NYCHA's capital fund allocation of $420 in 2001. It is not possible for NYCHA to address urgent capital needs of its public housing unless the federal commitment is renewed with a long-term program of investment addressing capital needs. Another area of important concern to me is the National Infrastructure Investment Program, known as the Tiger Grant Program. Funding for the Tiger Grant programs has been reduced from $600 million in 2014 to $100 million in 2015. It is $1.15 billion below the President's 2015 budget request. Underfunding this program will leave states and local governments that are competing for and depend on these grants with a few resources. As a result, projects will be slowed or even canceled. Much-needed repairs to our infrastructure will not take place, and construction jobs will not be created. Now, I realize that my last comments were not as interesting as the jalapeno story, but nevertheless, this can create heartburn locally to a lot of folks if they don't get the proper funding. And I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank both for the work that they've done on this bill.
Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In this hour of affection, I couldn't help but weigh in a little bit. I wanted to make sure it wasn't one-sided and it was only the minority that spoke up, but let me share just a brief story about Congressman Latham. In our early days, when we came to Congress together, we had something that I would call a corn cook-off. And of course, you normally don't identify New Jersey with corn, but we actually do grow it. It's very sweet, and so we set something up at the American Legion back the Capitol, and of course the New Jersey corn won because yes, we did. Because the distance that we brought our corn was much shorter than the distance that the corn, by the time the corn arrived from Iowa, it was pure starch. Well, we were your, and to Ed Pasteur, thank you for the time that we shared on energy and water, and of course, water is pretty critical to the state of Arizona. But thank you for also taking on the huge obligation with me, as I've done with Pete Visklosky, on our nuclear navy, the things we need to do to make sure that the Secretary of Energy can verify, though we would never use it, our nuclear stockpile. It was great to work with you, and I wish both of you Godspeed. Thank you.
Further general discussion? If not, are there amendments? Chairman?
Mr. Chairman, first of all, thank the members for their kind words here today, except for Rodney. But lying about sweet corn is not good. Anyway, Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will read.
Amendment offered by Mr. Latham.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with. The gentleman's recognized.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before you is the standard manager's amendment making non-controversial, technical, and requested changes to the bill and the report. The amendment has been drafted in consultation and cooperation with Ranking Member Pastor and the minority, and I urge the adoption of the amendment.
Mr. Pastor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also want to thank my colleague who said those kind words to us. The Chairman has your changes with our side, and we have no objection to them. The amendment contains technical corrections to the bill and some report language to clarify the intent of the new parts of the bill. I encourage adoption of the amendment, and I yield back.
Mr. Moran.
Yeah. I'm not going to oppose this manager's amendment, Mr. Chairman, but I would like to be recognized to share what is an important issue to any member that has an airport in or near their congressional district. Last month, the Federal Aviation Administration issued a proposed new rule called the one-engine inoperative rule. Now, most people have no clue what this means, but it turns out that it's going to cost local communities tens of millions of dollars and ultimately billions of dollars in economic growth. A building can be as much as 2 miles away from an airport under this new rule, and you have to reduce the height by 90 feet. There are more than 4,000 buildings currently existent who will be out of compliance if this rule goes into effect. And obviously, there are thousands and thousands of buildings under consideration that would be impacted by this. So why would the FAA do this? Well, I've asked the airlines, and they say it just doesn't happen that one of the engines goes out. We've had millions of flights. It hasn't happened. So what's behind this? What's behind it is that the airlines want to be able to load more passengers and more cargo on their planes so they can make more money. And of course, the airports authorities are happy with that because they get some of that money. But who pays the price? The local communities that are in or around airports are going to pay that price with substantially restricted economic development opportunities. That's the issue. Now, the manager's amendment says, well, we'd like the FAA to think about doing a cost-benefit analysis. I think that's a little tepid, frankly, but in the typically conciliatory approach we take to these things, we're not going to object to it. But I do think that the members should be aware of the ramifications of this rule. It's proposed rule goes right through rather than having the kind of public comment, the kind of cost-benefit analysis that you would normally have. And in this case, that's a very serious omission. So I want to make the members aware of that, and that's why I asked to be recognized. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Further discussion? The question is on the manager's amendment. All in favor, say aye. Aye. All opposed will say no. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Are there other amendments? Ms. Louie?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk, and
Clerk will read.
Amendment offered by Mrs. Lowy. Page 4.
I offer this amendment with my
Reading
colleagues.
is dispensed with. The gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you. I offer this amendment with my colleagues, Mr. Quigley, Mr. Schiff, and Ms. Pingree. This amendment would add $825 million in funding to the Railroad Safety Technology Grant Program to support railroads' development and implementation of positive train control. This amount reflects the funding level included in the President's request to further the implementation of PTC systems across the country. This amendment is not offset. PTC is a critical safety technology, which, according to the National Transportation Safety Board, will prevent derailments like the one that occurred last year in the Bronx, New York, when a Metro-North train going over 80 miles per hour around a curve derailed, killing 4, including one of my constituents, and injuring 59 passengers. PTC would have also prevented a Metrolink train on collision in California in 2008 that killed 25 people and injured 100 more. In 2008, Congress passed the Rail Safety Improvement Act, mandating PTC implementation by the end of 2015. Since the mandate was put in place, the Congress has only provided PTC funding once when the fiscal year 2010 bill included $50 million. With the deadline approaching at the end of next year, we still haven't seen PTC installed where it should be. And according to the FRA, most commuter and freight railroads, including Metro-North, unsurprisingly are expected to miss the 2015 deadline. Look, my friends, if we're serious about ensuring the safety of our railroads, we must provide resources to help them implement PTC. For example, in my district, the Metropolitan Transportation Authority runs Metro-North in addition to the Long Island Railroad. To install PTC on these systems, it will cost an estimated $1 billion. This is in addition to other large capital needs faced by the MTA, which includes investments in response to Hurricane Sandy. MTA's cost isn't an outlier. FRA has estimated that the total capital cost for full PTC deployment on all affected railroads will be in excess of $10 billion. This Congress should uphold the commitment it made to railroads to defray the costs of installing this critical safety technology. Failing to fund PTC will only delay installation, which we cannot afford to do when it comes to the safety of the over 550,000 passengers who ride the Long Island Railroad and Metro-North trains every weekday. I thank Mr. Quigley, Mr. Schiff, Ms. Pingree for their support and urge adoption of this amendment.
Mr. Quigley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of the ranking member's amendment. The truth is the cost of implementing PTC are extraordinarily high. But we've placed this financial burden on the backs of our commuter railroads. Congress has mandated these commuter railroads implement PTC by the end of 2015, but has yet to put a single federal dollar behind that requirement. PTC implementation is forcing commuter railroads like Metro in my district to choose between performing critical system safety maintenance projects and implementing this unfunded mandate. Critical state of good repair backlogs are already creeping toward $80 billion on our nation's public transportation systems. The estimated cost of PTC for Metro in my district alone is around $220 million. That's 150% more than Metro's annual entire capital program. Metro simply can't afford to implement in PTC without sacrificing other investments which are critical to railroad safety. They're going to have to choose. It's not any kind of choice they want to make. These include improvements to existing tracks, stations, signals, and other infrastructure that makes Metro safe. Mr. Chairman, I know all of us on this committee want to make our railroads, commuter and freight, to be as safe as possible. With respect, let's put our money where our mouths are. Thank you.
Chairman Latham.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to have to oppose the amendment just because it's not offset, and $825 million not offset would put us well over our allocation. But having said that, I share your concerns very, very much. And PTC is a very important safety initiative. It's the National Transportation Safety Board's most wanted list for quite a while now, for years. And while some progress on it has been, on the deployment has occurred, I think meeting the December 2015 deadline is going to be an uphill climb at best. But I would hope that we could work together on this, find some more funds if we can somewhere, because it is an extremely important initiative and we need to address the problem. So, but I must oppose the amendment because of the offset, the lack of offset. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. DeLauro.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I am pleased to hear that the chairman of the subcommittee is interested in looking at ways in which we can increase the funding for PTC. I support the amendment, Mrs. Lowy's amendment, $825 million for the implementation of positive train control safety technology. It has been very serious along the Metro North line most recently. We have witnessed recent tragedies, several of them. And the Metro North line, and I'll be parochial, services many of my constituents. In total, tragically, there have been 5 deaths and approximately 129 injuries over the past year alone on Metro North due to the derailments in Bridgeport, Connecticut, and in the Bronx in New York. We need to work to minimize the accidents we've seen. We need to improve rail safety for all of our railroads nationwide. That's workers, passengers, nearby residents alike. It's not about one area, one line. This affects everyone. PTC, let me just say what it is. It is a technology that prevents 2 trains on the same track from colliding. It already requires by law, it's required on 60,000 miles of railroad track by the end of next year. We can't get there without providing the necessary funding to keep our nation's commuters safe. I would hope that the issue, especially in light of the recent tragedies, would prompt us to look at how we can, in fact, raise the amount of money in order to move forward in this effort. Let me take a moment to say thank you to the chair and to the ranking member for including language in the manager's amendment from the Rail Safety Enforcement Bill, which I introduced, which directs the Federal Railroad Administration to provide a progress report to the House and Senate committees on appropriations on the status of railroad compliance with positive train control requirement. There are deep concerns about the House HUD proposal. There is no funding for high-speed rail, and you can't grow economically in this nation if we do not have high-speed rail. We've rejected the President's $2.3 billion request for the Rail Service Improvement Program that helps to fund this PTC implementation. I want to urge my colleagues to vote for this amendment because what it does, it puts our nation's railroad system on a path to safety. We continue to talk about the railroads, one of the greatest pieces of infrastructure that this nation developed. In the very most difficult times, it was Abraham Lincoln who allowed for the funding of the Trans-Pacific Railroad. But now needs to be maintained in a way that provides a safety to those who travel on a daily basis. So I urge my colleagues to support Ranking Member Lowy's amendment.
Mr. Schiff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be very brief. I rise in support of the amendment. I remember all too well the carnage and unforgettable images of the 2008 train collision in Chatsworth, California, very close to my district, when 25 people were killed and 102 were injured. The tragedy was only compounded by the fact that this could have and should have been prevented, as the NTSB has been advocating for positive train control since 1970. As national leaders, the safety and well-being of our fellow Americans is our highest priority, and to have the capability to drastically reduce the chance of rail accidents and to not pursue it for decades is an abdication of that responsibility. Senator Feinstein and I partnered with our colleagues to push for legislation to make sure a similar accident would not happen again. And we continue to push to ensure that progress to implement positive train control across the nation continues so that all trains that share the same tracks will have this system or an interoperable alternative in place before the deadline. The implementation of this should not be further delayed. Through the investigation of 25 accidents in the last decade, NTSB has found that 65 deaths and over 1,000 injuries could have been prevented by this technology. The system would have prevented the November 2013 Metro North train in New York from derailing after an operator nodded off and approached a 30-mile-an-hour bend at 82 miles an hour. That accident in New York caused the deaths of 4 and injuries to more than 60. The lesson has been taught again and again with the lives of friends and neighbors. We don't need another lesson. Let's make sure all rail agencies across the country have the funding necessary to make positive train control a reality. I thank you and yield back.
Ms. Pingree.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will be brief as well. I have to admit that I didn't know anything about PTC or the technology behind running trains. We have trains going through our state of Maine, but hadn't really experienced much tragedy until the one you heard about, I'm sure, last year, 10 miles from the Maine border in the small Quebec town of Lac-Mégantic. This was a horrendous accident where 78 tank cars carrying crude oil from the Bakken, the shale fields in North Dakota, were headed to the state of Maine through St. John to go to a St. John, New Brunswick refinery. An operator left the train alone and thought he set the brakes, and all of a sudden there was a runaway train headed right into a very small town. I think on a Saturday night, killed 47 people who had no expectations that when they went out that night to party and see their friends and gather in their community, it would be their last night. It devastated the community. It was a disaster of unthinkable proportions for anyone who's used to how people experience these things in rural towns. So just to say, that was my first opportunity to really understand so much more about train safety, about the issues that we experience, and then one after another, whether it was hearing about Metro North or realizing that there are so many accidents that could have been prevented. And like so many people who discussed this incident with me, I had no idea we didn't have a system like PTC. You know, we all commute every week down here on our airplanes from all over the country on U.S. Air and United Airlines, and we just have an expectations that the air traffic controllers will be there in the towers, and they know when we're coming and going, and they make sure we land safely. It doesn't occur to most of us that when you get on the train, there's no GPS tracking system. There's nothing there that occurs that lets people know if the train's about to collide or if there's anything else there. How could we have such a huge disconnect, and how could we not know in a little Quebec town that a train that was headed to Maine with 78 tank cars was unattended and started taking off on its own? It's just unthinkable. And I know my constituents were shocked to know that there was nothing there. I can't believe we would abdicate our responsibility for safety here. I can't think of ever talking to those families in that small Quebec town or the many towns in Maine where that could have happened and say, oh yeah, we passed up our opportunity to put in the technology that would have made everybody safe. I hope that you will all support this amendment today. I hate to go back home and tell people that we haven't made a necessary investment that we take for granted in our air traffic system, but think nothing about in our rail system. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Ms. Lowy is recognized for a minute to close.
Well, first I want to thank Mr. Quigley, Mr. Schiff, Ms. Pingree for speaking in favor of this amendment. Mr. Chairman, as you can see, there is widespread support on the committee for committing resources to PTC installation. However, I understand that my amendment lacks an offset and that resources don't presently exist in the bill to support my amendment. If the chairman would commit to work with me and my colleagues to identify additional resources if they become available, I will withdraw the amendment. I see the shake of the head.
I would be more than happy to work with the gentlelady.
Well, I would look forward to working with you, and I want to thank. I hope it's in this session because I've enjoyed working with you.
Is there a chaperone available?
So I just want to say, Mr. Chairman, I look forward to working with you as this bill moves through the process, and I want to thank your understanding because I know we share that commitment.
And
thank you very much. I withdraw the amendment.
Withdrawn. Further amendments, Mr. Moran.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment on the desk.
Clerk will read.
Amendment offered by Mr. Moran, page 44, line 20, increase the dollar amount by $200 million and conform the committee report to increase the amount recommended for Amtrak.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I feel ashamed of myself. I just feel like such a wimp. You know, you remember the days, I know, Mr. Chairman, when us Democrats used to get up and ask for expansions of programs, ask for an increase so we could grow our economy. And I guess you've so beaten us back, so discouraged us, that all we do now is just ask for level funding. And that's all this amendment does. This bill cuts $200 million out of Amtrak capital grants. And instead of asking so that we could grow and improve the rails and keep many tens of thousands more vehicles off the road and onto the rails, all this amendment would do is just to keep Amtrak funding at the existing level. That's all. We're funding it at the level that was mentioned. It's $1 billion roughly dollars, and now we're going to fund it at 850, a $200 million cut. And we don't know what the impact of that is going to be. We know it's going to hurt many communities. It's going to reduce Amtrak's ability to maintain its rolling stock, to be able to offer a quality ride. And we're going to have more cars on the road and more pollution. So it's all I'm doing is just asking, can we just keep the program funded at the existing level, Mr. Chairman? It's as simple an amendment as possible. I would hope somebody else would support it as well. I know Mrs. Lowy would like to see it, and with that, I'll conclude my remarks. And I'm anxious to hear from Mr. Latham, of course.
Well, it's nice to know you're a flaming moderate today, but I hear what you're talking about. Obviously, the constraints we have in the bill with the FHA really put a lot of pressure on our bill. And without offset, you have no offset, and without the offset, it will violate the 302B allocation, and so therefore I can't support it, and I would urge a no vote for that reason only.
Mr. Farr?
Chairman, I rise in support of this amendment, and I think that the committee ought to sort of readjust its thinking on this mood of just cut, squeeze, and trim, particularly in this bill. This is the people's bill. We're talking about basic transportation in America and housing for the poorest people in this country. And all of us come from local governments. And I think you can see what's happened with the economy in this country, that it's starting to pick up. And now the problems are investment in infrastructure. And this bill does it. I mean, why is California trying to deal with a high-speed rail? Very controversial. But it's because we have no alternative in the transportation corridor between the large population centers in Southern California and Northern California. It's the busiest air traffic corridor in the United States. We have trains, and they're old, and we're beginning, as the East has done, is to develop trains that are run by the state and by local transportation authorities. Amtrak is part of that essential puzzle to get people to and from work, because our freeways are crowded. They're so overpacked that we can't add more lanes. The air corridors are packed. We can't add more aircraft because there's no landing space, or in the airports not enough room. We are just up to our limits. And I think that if we deny this infrastructure investing in transportation, Amtrak being part of it, we're doing it at our own peril. And we're really hurting the working class people that really rely on these transportation systems. Now, we want to build an economy in this country. We're bold about building that economy, as pointed out in building the Transcontinental Railway. We were bold in building the U.S. highway system, interstate highway system. We were bold in the investment of bringing aircraft and you know, the whole building of airports and supporting it. Those were huge public investments. And it seems to me that we're here sort of taking glee with how much money we're able to cut. But that cut is about employment. That's at those blue-collar jobs. These monies are spent by private contractors in our communities. So I don't think we ought to glee about savings. I think we ought to be ashamed about the lack of expenditure in investment in our infrastructure and our people. I think you should support this amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I want to associate myself with my colleagues' words on infrastructure. We have countries that we point to, and we have concern about how competitive we are with them, but in China, it is at least between 8 and 10% of their GDP, which they're focused in on infrastructure. India, it's about 4%. Brazil doing the same thing. The United States, it's about 2% of our GDP is spent on infrastructure. Come from the Northeast. The Northeast has the oldest infrastructure in the nation. And every day it's being played out in one way or another, whether it is roads or bridges or rail or water systems, energy, environment, all of these pieces without the kinds of proper maintenance will collapse on us, and we see it over and over again. It's one of the reasons why I rise in strong support of my colleague from Virginia's amendment. It's $200 million. It brings this to level funding. Amtrak is a national enterprise. It employs people in 47 of the 48 contiguous states. If it were an airline, it would be the 6th largest carrier in the nation on the basis of domestic ridership. So, and again, parochial, the Northeast Corridor, the most heavily trafficked and utilized area of the nation. It is just singularly critical to economic survival. And this is what workers, what families rely on. It unclogs our roads, it reduces our dependence on foreign oil, and it keeps our air clean. It, as I said, grows that economy. Amtrak has turned a $4.4 billion federal investment into nearly $12.6 billion in return to the American economy, while covering 88% of its operating costs. And, you know, above all, let's look at the economics and the economics of investing in infrastructure. Again, this is a nation that used to build things. We no longer do that. We consume things that are built in other countries, which is why for the last 14 years I have introduced a national infrastructure bank, a public-private partnership where we can look at how we invest in our infrastructure and to grow the economy. The Northeast Corridor needs billions in needed repairs. We've talked about the train derailments in the past year and the accidents that have killed workers. I have, and some of my other colleagues have put forward a comprehensive rail safety bill to help to prevent these tragedies in the future. But we need to upgrade Amtrak's deteriorating infrastructure, keep our workers safe. This probably may turn you to vote against it, but I do travel in trains. I go back and forth to New Haven, Connecticut, from Union Station to Union Station by train twice a week. And it is one of the best, and I know Mr. Frelinghuysen is on the train often when I see him going up to New Jersey. A number of us, Mr. Serrano and others, because it is a fast way to travel. It is a safe way to travel if we provide the money for the improvements, and it is an efficient way to travel, and and that's why we need to invest in it like we invested in this effort nationwide years ago. Let's get back to the big concepts, the bold concepts that made this nation great, and stop nickel and diming the infrastructure and Amtrak.
Ms. Lilly.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the gentleman for introducing this amendment. I rise in strong support of the gentleman's amendment. This additional $200 million is absolutely essential to the operation of Amtrak. It will restore its funding to the FY14 level. And without these funds, Amtrak must defer critical investments that are needed to bring Amtrak assets up to a state of good repair. In the long run, frankly, my colleagues, these cuts, so eloquently expressed by my friend Mr. Moran, they frankly don't save taxpayers any money. By forcing Amtrak to put off repairs and improvements, what we only do is sacrifice Amtrak's reliability and service. Additionally, at a time when Amtrak enjoys record-level ridership, we're only doing a disservice to its passengers by forcing Amtrak to cut back on track, signal, and bridge repairs. And I know that the chairman is a strong supporter of Amtrak. I hope we can work together to resolve this issue as we move forward in the process. And as I close, I just want to repeat again Mr. Moran's statement, Mr. Lauro, Mr. Farr, this is jobs. When you're investing in infrastructure, you're creating jobs, you're putting people to work. So in addition to the reliability, in addition to the safety of Amtrak, which is so critical to all the riders, we are creating jobs, strengthening our economy, and that's what this is all about. We have a responsibility to those who want to work, are middle class, unfortunately, is at a point where there are too many people who think they're middle class, but they can't even get a job today. So this is important for all those reasons, and I do hope that my colleagues will support this amendment.
Mr. Moran is recognized to close.
All right, Mr. Chairman, insufficient revenue, out of control entitlements, and what do we get? Disinvestment in our economy and in the future of our communities. $200 million cut from the existing level of funding for the major rail system along the East Coast. And it's all over the country, 48 states. It's going to hurt the economy in almost in every state on this continent, really. And we're going ahead with it because we don't have any offset. We don't blame you or Mr. Latham or Mr. Pastor, and it's not the fault for the most part of this committee, but something's wrong. We should not be disinvesting in the physical infrastructure of this country. So that's why I'll ask for a recorded vote on this, Mr. Chairman.
Question is on the Moran amendment. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed will say no.
No.
The noes seem to have it. The noes have it.
Ask for a recorded vote.
A recorded vote is requested and a sufficient number backing. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Adderholt? No. Mr. Adderholt, no. Mr. Amadei? No. Mr. Amadei, no. Mr. Bishop? Yes. Mr. Bishop, aye. Mr. Calvert? Mr. Calvert, no. Mr. Carter? No. Mr. Carter, no. Mr. Cole? No. Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Crenshaw? Mr. Crenshaw, no. Mr. Cuellar? Yes. Mr. Cuellar, aye. Mr. Culberson? Mr. Culberson? Mr. Culberson, no. Ms. DeLauro? Aye. Ms. DeLauro, aye. Mr. Dent? No. Mr. Dent, no. Mr. Diaz-Balart? No. Mr. Diaz-Balart, no. Mr. Farr? Aye. Mr. Farr, aye. Mr. Fatah? Mr. Fleischman? No. Mr. Fleischman, no. Mr. Fortenberry? No. Mr. Fortenberry, no. Mr. Frelinghuysen? No. Mr. Frelinghuysen, no. Ms. Granger? No. Ms. Granger, no. Mr. Graves? No. Mr. Graves, no. Dr. Harris? No. Dr. Harris, no. Ms. Harrow-Butler? No. Ms. Harrow-Butler, no. Mr. Honda? Mr. Honda, aye. Mr. Joyce? Mr. Joyce, no. Ms. Capter?
Aye.
Ms. Capter, aye. Mr. Kingston? Mr. Latham?
No.
Mr. Latham, no. Ms. Lee?
Aye.
Ms. Lee, aye. Mrs. Lowy?
Aye.
Mrs. Lowy, aye. Ms. McCullum? Aye. Ms. McCullum, aye. Mr. Moran?
Aye.
Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Nunnally?
No.
Mr. Nunnally, no. Mr. Owens?
Aye.
Mr. Owens, aye. Mr. Pastor?
Aye.
Mr. Pastor, aye. Ms. Pingree? Aye. Ms. Pingree, aye. Mr. Price? Aye. Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Quigley? Mr. Quigley, aye. Mrs. Roby? No. Mrs. Roby, no. Mr. Rogers? No. Mr. Rogers, no. Mr. Rooney? No. Mr. Rooney, no. Ms. Roby-Allard? Aye. Ms. Roby-Allard, aye. Mr. Ryan? Mr. Ryan, aye. Mr. Schiff? Aye. Mr. Schiff, aye. Mr. Serrano? Aye. Mr. Serrano, aye. Mr. Simpson? Mr. Simpson, no. Mr. Stewart? No. Mr. Stewart, no. Mr. Valadeo? No. Mr. Valadeo, no. Mr. Visclosky? Aye. Mr. Visclosky, aye. Ms. Wasserman Schultz? Aye. Ms. Wasserman Schultz, aye. Mr. Wolf? No. Mr. Wolf, no. Mr. Womack? No. Mr. Womack, no. Mr. Yoder? No. Mr. Yoder, no.
Are there members who wish to be recorded? Mr. Fatah? Or to change their vote?
Mr. Fatah, aye.
Clerk will tally. On this vote, the yeas are 22, the nays are 28. The amendment is not agreed to. Mr. Price?
Mr. Chairman,
Not agreed to. Not
What'd I say?
Not agreed to.
It's not agreed to. Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Price?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment of the desk, and I ask that the reading be suspended.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
This amendment is the Tiger amendment, the restoration of Tiger grant funding.
Amendment offered by Mr. Price.
Mr. Chairman, unfortunately, this bill calls for dramatic funding decrease of over 80% in the National Infrastructure Investments, or Tiger grant program, rather than what we should be doing, doubling down on these investments as the President's proposed budget would have done. So I'm pleased to offer an amendment along with Representatives Lee, Wasserman Schultz, Pingree, Quigley, Capter, Fatah, and DeLauro that would restore funding for this program to $600 million, which is the fiscal 14 enacted level. Let me just first address the obvious objection that the amendment's not offset. I'm well aware it's not offset. Obviously, ordinarily when we want to add spending to a bill, we find an offset. Offsets are often difficult to find. In this bill, they're impossible to find. Budget constraints we've placed on ourselves have made that nearly impossible. So extraordinary means are called for, such as proposing an increase in Tiger funds without an offset. Tell me, where's that going to come from? Where is that reality check going to come from? That insistence on workable budget numbers, realistic priorities, where's it going to come from if not from this committee? This amendment I'm offering is perfectly permissible within our rules, and it's essential unless we're content to see our committee and the appropriations process fade into irrelevance. I hope we're thinking clearly about what a disaster that would be for our institution and for our country. Now, briefly, the merits of the Tiger Discretionary Grant Program. Members know Tiger grants offer a unique opportunity for our Transportation Department to invest in shovel-ready projects across transportation modes that propose to achieve national transportation objectives. Each innovative project is multimodal, multi-jurisdictional, and/or otherwise challenging to fund through existing programs. This has been an extraordinarily successful program, very flexible, very popular. We've all heard from mayors, town managers, public agencies in our districts. Many of us have written support letters for grant applications or participated in ribbon-cutting events. Certainly a program of interest in my district, where we were fortunate to receive funds for our multimodal Raleigh Union Station. But we know we're not alone. Tiger's provided $3.5 billion for 270 critical infrastructure projects covering all 50 states, the D.C., and Puerto Rico. About 10% of these projects are in districts belonging to members of this committee on both sides of the aisle. In the first 5 rounds, DOT received more than 5,300 project proposals, seeking more than $115 billion. What more proof could we have that the demand for this program is great? And even with somewhat more robust funding in recent years, only 4 to 8% of grant applicants have received funding. In the current application round, U.S. DOT has received about 800 applications, requesting a total of $9.5 billion, with only $600 million to invest. That's a request of more than 15 times what can be awarded. This bill would make that situation far, far worse next year. Now, there's some deja vu here. The House has tried to cut or eliminate Tiger funding in the past. I still don't know why. I can't imagine why. The projects that have previously received Tiger funding and those that are anxiously awaiting an award announcement will create good-paying jobs, spur local economic development, revive our city centers, and create regional integrated transportation solutions. It's a great program, and I urge my colleagues to support this amendment.
Mr. Latham.
Mr. Chairman, I rise to oppose the amendment. The amendment proposes to increase funding without an offset, thus causing the bill to exceed our 302B allocation. I urge a no vote.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you very much. Rise in support of the amendment. I don't want to repeat what my colleague, Mr. Price, very ably described the benefits to this amendment. I'm going to talk about this from the perspective of how silly it is that we are debating this yet again. I mean, at least we are no longer debating whether or not the majority is going to zero out Tiger grant funding. I mean, the hypocrisy, and I mean that with the utmost respect, but the hypocrisy that is represented here when members of Congress support zeroing out funds from a program, but yet later on sign letters of support, enthusiastically advocate for projects that are sponsored and initiated by their local government that clearly create jobs and spur economic investment in your communities, particularly in some blighted urban downtown areas, some small, some large. This just makes no sense. It's silly. The other important point is that we should stop doing things here that we know are simply not going to happen. We are not only going to have $100 million in the Tiger Grant program, just like we weren't going to have zero funds in the Tiger Grant program, because we have a Senate that strongly supports the Tiger Grant program. So let's try to work together on a realistic amount of funding that makes sure that we can provide for the transportation infrastructure needs, the economic development needs of our communities, the ones that we each publicly support once this funding becomes available and becomes law in the Appropriations Act when the President signs it, and stop pretending, stop cutting off our nose to spite our face. Each of us understands the benefits of the Tiger Grant program, and I don't understand, it's baffling to me, and to so many of us, why the majority continues to propose ridiculous amounts of funding, if any, for a program that each of you clearly supports as individuals. So thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlelady refers to us, I think she's saying, as being two-faced, reminding me a little bit of what Lincoln told Douglas in the debates. When Douglas accused him of being two-faced, as you know, Lincoln said, "I'll leave it to the audience. If I had two faces, do you think I'd be wearing this one?" Mr. Quigley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think a better word would be perhaps inconsistent, but I rise in support of this amendment. And let me say this. We talk about popularity of a program and how necessary it is. Since 2009, the Tiger program has awarded $3.5 billion to 270 projects in all 50 states, the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico, including 100 projects to support rural communities. The demand has been so overwhelming because states and localities want and need this program. Over the last 5 rounds, DOT received 5,300 applications requesting $115 billion for infrastructure funding around the country. It's been mentioned that this creates jobs. Let's talk about that for a second. Every $1 billion invested in infrastructure creates roughly 30,000 jobs. Now, I know there are those here who weren't particularly fond of the Recovery Act, but let's look at an aspect of that dealt with infrastructure. Only about 6 or 7% of that bill dealt with infrastructure. Those projects, though, were responsible for 2/3 of the jobs created under that act. Very, very important, obviously very important to the city of Chicago. I guess I'll close by saying I was beginning to wonder why the committee changed the name of Tiger to the National Infrastructure Investments. I understand. But let's see, Tiger sounds aggressive. It sounds tough. Sounds like you're serious about rebuilding our country. Sounds like you're serious about creating jobs. So if we're not, let's change it to something less aggressive, and let's call it the kitten grants, right? We're sort of serious about rebuilding our country. We're sort of kitten-like serious about creating jobs. Thank you, and I yield back.
Mr. Honda.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise to support this amendment also. Almost daily we hear reports about our nation's crumbling infrastructure and the need to invest in repairs and upgrades. The Tiger Grant program is the most flexible program we have for investing in smaller and innovative transportation projects. The demand for the program is abundantly clear. In this fiscal year, we appropriated $600 million for Tiger grants. 797 applications were submitted from 49 states, territories, and District of Columbia, seeking a total of $9.5 billion in funding. The projects that Tiger supports spurs economic development, creates jobs, we know that, and improve transportation options for communities. The city of Fremont in my district is thinking about applying for a Tiger grant in the future to build a pedestrian bridge to connect a soon-to-be-open BART station to a newly redeveloped commercial and residential area, which will expand transit use, create jobs, and spur economic growth. There is no other source of federal funds for projects like this, which is why it is essential we keep the Tiger Grant program alive and provide it with robust funding. And I urge my colleagues to support this amendment.
Ms. Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also rise in support of Mr. Price's amendment and want to thank him very much for offering it, as well as the co-sponsors of it. Like so many communities across the nation, my home district in California's East Bay continues to face the dual challenge of aging infrastructure and high unemployment rates. And we know that one of the most effective ways to address these problems is through smart and targeted investments in infrastructure projects that keep our roads and highways safe, our freight moving, and our people working. That's exactly what the Tiger program, the Tiger grants do. I know firsthand, first of all, the effectiveness of this program in my own district, at the Port of Oakland, for example, and the East Bay Greenway, where local agencies have leveraged Tiger funds to bring shovel-ready projects towards completion. And I know this is also the case for many projects in many of our colleagues' districts on both sides of the aisle. Unfortunately, this funding bill includes a $500 million cut from last year to this smart, once again, it's smart, it's targeted, and it's competitive. At just $100 million, this is $1.15 billion below the administration's request. So this simple amendment would increase that number by $500 million, allowing for deserving projects around the country to compete for transportation investment that's really needed and key to growing our economy and creating jobs. It's really what the American people are waiting for us to do. We try to extend unemployment compensation on the floor. We can't seem to do that. Now we have an opportunity to create more jobs, and I hope we do this today. People need to work in our country. So I ask our colleagues to support this amendment. It's badly needed. Not supporting this, yet showing up in our districts to cut ribbons when our district receives the Tiger Fund grant. Really, it's hypocritical, it's inconsistent, and it is two-faced. And I know members of this committee don't want this tag. So thank you again, and I hope we support this amendment.
Ms. Lloyd.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I do want to say I don't usually speak on so many amendments, but this bill is so important. An investment in our infrastructure creates jobs and strengthens the economy. And I know this is a bipartisan concern, and frankly, I'm puzzled as why we can't get more bipartisan support for these amendments. This is an important amendment, and I am strongly supportive of Mr. Price's amendment because the Tiger program remains the one discretionary program within the Department of Transportation that allows the states and cities And these states are Republican and Democratic states and Republican and Democratic cities. I just don't understand why we can't get bipartisan support for this. Just last month, the Department of Transportation received 790 applications for the $600 million in Tiger funds that was provided in FY 2014. These applications totaled more than $9.5 billion. Since the Tiger program was created in 2009, the dollar volume of applications for each round of funds has far exceeded the funds available. So the demand for the program is clear. This is a program that invests in our infrastructure. It creates jobs for the men and women who work in construction, where the national unemployment rate is 9.4%. I urge the adoption of this amendment, and I yield back.
Ms. Kaptur.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members. I rise in support of the Price Amendment. I don't know who invented the word infrastructure. A lot of my constituents can't even pronounce it. But I can tell you they talk to me about potholes all the time, especially after the harsh winter we've gone through. They talk about crumbling bridges. They talk about onerous traffic jams all over this country. And every economic study shows that infrastructure investment yields jobs from coast to coast. So I would urge the majority, as we move toward the floor, let's find a mechanism to be more realistic. We know that the nation has asked us for close to $10 billion. They have $9.5 billion in high priority projects that have been submitted 15 times more than the current level of funding, $600 million. This budget, this bill proposes cutting that down to $100 million. It is completely unrealistic in terms of what the nation is facing. The President recommended doubling the program to $1.25 billion. That's maybe 10% of what the nation is asking us for. And so I think there's pretty strong feeling that this is truly underfunded. It is an extraordinarily important program for jobs. It's one where communities are lined up one after another. We simply have to find a way to do this as we move forward. So I support the Price Amendment very strongly. We should restore it to levels that are more realistic, and I really think this committee has a special responsibility to do so on behalf of the country. So I would urge my colleagues to support the Price Amendment, and I thank the gentleman for offering it.
Mr. Laurel.
Mr. Chairman, I just have one comment, and we've talked a lot about jobs and what the creation of infrastructure, or of investing in infrastructure can do about creating jobs. The one thing associated with those jobs that we haven't mentioned, which I think is critically important, and that is these are jobs that cannot be outsourced. They cannot be outsourced. And this nation ought to know that we are refusing to fund those programs that will keep the jobs here in the United States when we do so much, even in this committee and in other committees, to provide all of the tax breaks, all of the opportunities for business to take their jobs overseas today, and we don't blink an eye when we go there, but we find it that we cannot afford the money to do something about making sure that we have a sound and safe infrastructure, put people to work, and keep the jobs here. I think this is something that the nation ought to really hear and know about. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Price is recognized for a minute to close.
Mr. Chairman, I believe our colleagues have made a very compelling case. I could read down this list. I won't, but it's a very compelling list of members of this committee who have welcomed these projects to our district. And as you read the list, you realize what an impact these have made, and it's very sobering to realize there are hundreds more where this came from. You know, we could be doing so much more in terms of job creation, in terms of infrastructure development. I can think of a single program in this area where the demonstrated impact and the demonstrated need is greater. So let's, as a committee, let's on a bipartisan basis register our support for this and our determination that one way or another, as we go further in this appropriations process, we're going to find the funding because we know our country needs it.
Question is on the Price amendment. All in favor will say aye.
Aye.
All opposed will say no.
No.
The noes seem to have it. The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. Is a roll call requested?
Yes, record vote.
Roll call is granted. Clerk, call the roll.
Mr. Adderholt. Mr. Adderholt, no. Mr. Amadei. Mr. Amadei, no. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop, aye. Mr. Calvert. Mr. Calvert, no. Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter, no. Mr. Cole. Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Crenshaw. Mr. Crenshaw, no. Mr. Cuellar. Mr. Cuellar, aye. Mr. Culberson. Mr. Culberson, no. Ms. DeLauro. Ms. DeLauro, aye. Mr. Dent. Mr. Dent, no. Mr. Diaz-Balart. Mr. Diaz-Balart, no. Mr. Farr. Mr. Farr, aye. Mr. Fatah. Mr. Fatah, aye. Mr. Fleischman. Mr. Fleischman, no. Mr. Fortenberry. Mr. Fortenberry, no. Mr. Frelinghuysen. Mr. Frelinghuysen, no. Ms. Granger. Ms. Granger, no. Mr. Graves. Mr. Graves, no. Dr. Harris. Dr. Harris, no. Ms. Herrera-Butler. Ms. Herrera-Butler, no. Mr. Honda. Mr. Honda, aye. Mr. Joyce. Mr. Joyce, no. Ms. Capter. Aye. Ms. Capter, aye. Mr. Kingston. Mr. Latham. No. Mr. Latham, no. Ms. Lee. Ms. Lee, aye. Mrs. Lowy.
Aye.
Mrs. Lowy, aye. Ms. McCullum. Ms. McCullum, aye. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Nunnally. Mr. Nunnally, no. Mr. Owens. Mr. Owens, aye. Mr. Pastor.
Aye.
Mr. Pastor, aye. Ms. Pingree. Ms. Pingree, aye. Mr. Price. Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Quigley. Mr. Quigley, aye. Mrs. Roby. Mrs. Roby, no. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers, no. Mr. Rooney. Mr. Rooney, no. Ms. Robo-Allard. Ms. Robo-Allard, aye. Mr. Ryan. Mr. Ryan, aye. Mr. Schiff. Mr. Schiff, aye. Mr. Serrano. Mr. Serrano, aye. Mr. Simpson. Mr. Simpson, no. Mr. Stewart. Mr. Stewart, no. Mr. Valadeo. Mr. Valadeo, no. Mr. Visclosky. Mr. Visclosky, aye. Ms. Wasserman Schultz. Ms. Wasserman Schultz, aye. Mr. Wolf. Mr. Wolf, no. Mr. Womack. Mr. Womack, no. Mr. Yoder. Mr. Yoder, no.
Are there members who wish to be recorded or to change their vote? Clerk will tally. On this vote, the yeas are 22, the nays are 28. The amendment is not agreed to. Mr. Schiff.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to desk number 1.
Clerk will read.
Amendment offered by Mr. Schiff, page 80, line 22. After the colon, insert the following.
Mr. Chairman, I would request...
Without objection, reading is dispensed with. Gentlemen are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members. This amendment would properly compensate local housing authorities for the administration of Section 8 vouchers. It is a very small technical fix to the current program and would require HUD to use its own existing funds, so it would not increase any allocation to HUD. Public housing authorities provide an important service to tenants and landlords in administering HUD's Section 8 Housing Choice Voucher Program, which houses 2 million low-income families across the nation. One of the benefits of Section 8 Housing Choice Voucher Program is that once a family has been issued a voucher, the family can use that voucher to lease a unit anywhere in the United States that the program is administered. However, HUD does not adequately reimburse housing authorities for the administration of vouchers that have moved with a family. These vouchers, known as ported vouchers, are transferred from one housing authority to another when that person moves from one place to another. While the receiving housing authority shoulders the bulk of the administrative costs and responsibilities of the ported voucher, including processing annual income recertifications, annual inspections, moves, and interim recertifications, it's only paid a fraction of the administrative fee associated with the voucher. In addition to the administrative burdens associated with a ported voucher, Many local governments have had to use local funds to backfill this federal program. HUD recognizes that housing authorities are not adequately reimbursed for the administration of these ported vouchers and provides a special set-aside that is paid out once a year. While this additional funding is helpful, the annual discretionary lump sum makes fiscal planning and budgeting very difficult and unpredictable for local agencies because it's all done at the end of the year instead of during the course of the year. The amendment I have is not an attempt to reform the Section 8 program, but simply requires HUD to change the distribution of these funds from annual to monthly, which would help the housing authorities better budget and administer Section 8. There are no added costs associated with this amendment. It's offered along with my colleague Mike Honda of California, and I would urge that the amendment be supported.
Chairman Latham.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I must oppose the amendment. This is an issue that should be left to the authorizers. HUD already has the flexibility to provide additional administrative fees to accommodate public housing authorities that administer a large number of these portable vouchers. This amendment would actually undermine that flexibility that they have at HUD. And I would urge a no vote on the amendment and really urge talking to the authorizers to try and get actually something done if there is an issue here. But this really undermines their flexibility right now as far as helping out those PHAs. So I must oppose the amendment.
Mr. Honda.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I rise in support of the amendment. As my friend from California noted, public housing authorities are not being adequately reimbursed for the services they provide tenants and landlords by administering HUD's Housing Choice Voucher Program. And this is especially a problem when a family with a voucher moves from one housing authority to another. Due to HUD's reimbursement formula, the sending authority retains a portion of the administrative fees, even though it does almost none of the administrative work. And in my district, the Housing Authority of the County of Alameda, despite doing 98% of the administrative work, receives only 60 cents to the dollar for each ported voucher. This amendment simply changes the rate for all ported vouchers to fairly compensate housing authorities. Sequestration hit the public housing sector particularly hard, hampering efforts by housing authorities to plan and provide the best possible services. This rate adjustment will help housing authorities like Alameda County meet the needs of our constituents and honor the portability of the vouchers. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment.
Ms. Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me thank Mr. Schiff for offering this amendment and just say that this committee continues to underfund our affordable housing programs. Minimally, we should work to increase and ensure that our strapped public housing authorities are fully reimbursed for what they spend. This amendment makes very important changes to the reimbursement formula for Section 8 vouchers used by tenants that cross housing authority jurisdictions. It is certainly a step in the right direction that will allow for more reliable and adequate budgeting at our housing authorities. I'd like to note that this bill funds Section 8 tenant assistance programs at or below the President's request, depending on really how you calculate it. But it does nothing, mind you, regarding the 40,000 vouchers that were lost during the disastrous sequester. And while we know that this year's resetting of contracts for project-based Section 8 has resulted in low funding levels, we see that in this bill, of course. Rest assured that we will be here next year again fighting to make sure that the $1.8 billion needed to fulfill those contracts are included in the 2016 bill. And so minimally, we should at least help our housing authorities better manage their existing resources and hold HUD accountable in bearing and in providing due compensation for our housing authorities. That's the least we can do. So I urge a yes vote on this amendment. Thank you again, Mr. Schiff.
Mr. Schiff is recognized for a minute to close.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I won't take the full minute.
I'm sorry, will the gentleman
yes.
allow Mr. Wolf to be recognized?
I thank the gentleman for Virginia. I would hope, and and if you would withdraw this, that we could work together to find some solution, talk with the authorizers. If, in fact, we get into conference, that we can find a way to help you and help for flexibility. But I have real concerns about the way this is worded and the effect that would have. So I don't know if the gentleman would like to work with us, that we could maybe help him out. But otherwise, the future is bleak for your amendment otherwise. I yield back.
Mr. Chairman, I think I've just been made an offer I cannot refuse.
Okay.
I'll be happy to withdraw the amendment and work with my colleague.
Amendment is withdrawn. Ms. Capter.
Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will read.
Amendment offered by Ms. Capter.
I ask the
In the
amendment
item-
be considered as read.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with. The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
My amendment has to do with the Community Development Block Grant Program, and essentially it proposes to increase by about 9% the amount of funding in the program up to a level of $3,270,000,000, up from the $3 billion level currently. And why would we do this? First of all, because it's necessary. I can remember when the CDBG program, which is targeted to over 1,200 communities across our country, was well over $4 billion. So over time, this program has been reduced while communities across this country face enormous difficulties in readjusting, especially following the housing crisis of 2008. The figures that we have show that over 1,200 communities rely on CDBG. If any of you have been mayors, members of City Council, you know exactly how important this funding is. It is flexible in the sense that communities can decide whether to put it into economic development or housing or infrastructure or vital public services at the local level. Each year, an estimated 7,250 local governments have access to CDBG funds, and it reaches urban, rural, and suburban areas. You know well how it's used to create jobs in the communities you represent and retain businesses. The program, because it's fundamentally assisting repositioning at the local level of neighborhoods, of business strips and so forth, between 2005 and 13 is estimated has created over 330,000 jobs across this country. For every dollar that CDBG invests, another $4 in private sector dollars are leveraged along with local public dollars. I have to say that for the communities that I represent, and maybe you can think about the regions that you represent, we are still picking up the pieces, thousands of pieces of property that were abandoned, that were vacated because of the housing crisis. What I find incredible, and we are disappointing the country as Republicans and Democrats, every economic recovery has been led by housing, but for this one. Why are we not investing in housing in this country? Finally, the private market is picking up at the high end. But if you look at the middle class, what are all the polls showing? People are dropping out of the middle class. And equity, housing equity, which was accumulated since the Second World War, has totally evaporated for African Americans and for Hispanic Americans and for Caucasians at historic levels. So the Community Development Block Grant Program is one of those programs that is helping block after block, community after community, reposition itself. And to have actually a very meager level of funding, again, makes no sense to me. So I would ask the committee's forbearance. We do not have an offset in this, but you know how important this program is in the communities that you represent. As we move forward, Mr. Chairman, on the floor, and in conference with the Senate, I would hope we could do better in this program. We know how effective it is. It's proven itself. It's a job creator, and it's a community readjuster at a time when America really needs focus on community development, redevelopment, and revitalization. I ask for the committee's support of the amendment.
Chairman Latham.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think we all know how important the program is, and we've tried to be supportive with the allocation we had. We actually took some other money and increased this, the level that we have in the bill currently at $3 billion. But unfortunately, without an offset in this bill, it violates our 302B allocation. Therefore, unfortunately, I can't support it, and I would have to urge a no vote for that reason. Thank you.
Mr. Fattah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of the capital amendment. This is a program created by an administration, a Republican administration. It's set up in which the decisions are made at a local level. There's no one-size-fits-all. It works in every community in the country to improve the life circumstances of people who are struggling to stay or to get into the working class in our country. And so even though there's no offset and the fate of the amendment may be obvious, I wanted to rise because this really speaks to our responsibility. This was one of the revenue-sharing approaches that was used to help communities deal with challenges. It's worked extraordinarily well, and it's a program that has always enjoyed bipartisan support and support from mayors and county officials all across our country. And so I hope that at some point we can get on a more offensive effort in terms of restoring American communities. We have been through a lot over this economic period. This is a program that is helping, but could help so much more in each of our districts. So I wanted to rise in support of it, and I thank the chairman for allowing me the time.
Ms. Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mike's not on.
Mike.
As my colleague from Pennsylvania just said, this is a Republican-inspired initiative that has drawn bipartisan support over the years. Both sides, Republicans and Democrats, are talking about poverty this year, finally, looking at pathways out of poverty. And the CDBG initiative program, the framework for CDBG, affords millions of people these pathways out of poverty. It was intended to allow our states to do the work that they need to do and the flexibility to do it in the way the states want to do this, states' rights. Many states have leveraged federal money and created very innovative and effective programs that, again, have lifted millions out of poverty. This program has created jobs and it's strengthened local economies all over the country. Over the last 9 years, CDBG has created or retained over 330,000 jobs for low to moderate income people through economic development programs. It has helped over 1.1 million low and moderate income people with home rehabilitation, home ownership, energy efficiency, and other housing-related programs. And it's provided direct assistance to over 200,000 businesses. I could go on, but I think you have the facts. You know the numbers. It's a proven program that supports hundreds of thousands of jobs, helps our local economy, helps Americans lift themselves out of poverty. It should be fully funded. I strongly support Congresswoman Capter's amendment, and I think we have to remember that during this Great Recession, this program has fallen nearly $1 billion since 2010, and that really is a shame because we see this income inequality continues to grow in our communities. The wealth gap, now you're looking at 6 or 7 cents on the dollar for African Americans in terms of net worth. And so we're seeing this continue to happen. This program, the Community Development Block Grants, if fully funded, could really begin to help close this gap. So I urge you to really consider this and consider what has happened since 2010 as we decide how to vote on this amendment. I urge a yes vote on it.
Mr. Ryan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to also support my colleague from Ohio's amendment here. One of the issues with economic development, which I know whether we're in Ohio or some other area, we're trying to get our downtowns going. I know in Toledo, Youngstown, Akron, Hartford, wherever we are. Part of growing our economy is making sure that we have incubators, business accelerators, working on high-tech opportunities to grow businesses. And this program is essential to create the kind of lifestyle that we need in our downtowns. It's super important for our neighborhoods, but I think when you're trying to do public-private partnerships, when you're trying to grow the economy, when you're trying to partner with universities and cities, this money is essential to creating the environment that will take tech workers, for example, and pull them back into the downtown, to refurbish buildings and sidewalks and things that local governments can get creative with to make sure that there's an environment for us to grow the kind of tech workers, tech jobs, computer coding, whatever the case may be in these areas. This money is essential. The Tiger Grant's essential. Community Development Block Grant is essential. So I'd encourage this committee to support this amendment, and hopefully moving forward, because I'm pretty sure that this amendment is in the same position as Mr. Schiff's amendment, that we consider what is the economic development strategy in our country for communities all across the industrial Midwest that need this kind of investment. These local communities don't have the money. And it's nice to say pull yourself up by your bootstraps, but if you just had a steel mill with 1,000 people and it closed down, that's easier said than done. These are the investments that pull other private investment back into our urban centers, and I think it's critical, and I thank the gentlelady for offering it.
Ms. Kaptur is recognized for a minute to close.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all my colleagues who have spoken on behalf of this amendment. I want to thank the chairman of the subcommittee for allowing some funding to continue in the program. But I think I'm going to call for a vote on this amendment in hopes that as we move to the floor, we might find other ways to add to this program, and that maybe our voices will be heard over on the Senate side, and that we can get a more realistic allocation for a program that is proven. It is results-oriented, it is popular from coast to coast, and we know that it results in jobs and community revitalization at a time when our country still has an overhang of very high long-term unemployment and many communities that were bottomed out by the recession of 2008. It also is a spur to housing, which should be leading America out of this recovery. We've neglected that sector terribly, and we are paying the price of it from coast to coast. So I would urge support of the Kaptur Amendment to restore funding to the Community Development Block Grant Program.
Question is on the Kaptur Amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed will say no. No. The noes seem to have it. The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. A recorded vote is requested. A sufficient number responding. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Adderholt. Mr. Adderholt, no. Mr. Amadei. Mr. Amadei, no. Mr. Bishop. Yes. Mr. Bishop, aye. Mr. Calvert. Mr. Calvert, no. Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter, no. Mr. Cole. Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Crenshaw. Mr. Crenshaw, no. Mr. Cuellar. Mr. Culberson. Mr. Culberson, no. Ms. DeLauro. Ms. DeLauro, aye. Mr. Dent. Mr. Dent, no. Mr. Diaz-Balart. Mr. Diaz-Balart, no. Mr. Farr? Mr. Farr, aye. Mr. Fatah? Mr. Fatah, aye. Mr. Fleischman? Mr. Fleischman, no. Mr. Fortenberry? Mr. Fortenberry, no. Mr. Frelinghuysen? Mr. Frelinghuysen, no. Ms. Granger? Ms. Granger, no. Mr. Graves? Mr. Graves? Dr. Harris? Dr. Harris, no. Ms. Ferrero-Butler? Ms. Ferrero-Butler, no. Mr. Honda? Mr. Honda, aye. Mr. Joyce? Mr. Joyce, no. Ms. Kaptur? Ms. Kaptur, aye. Mr. Kingston? Mr. Latham? No. Mr. Latham, no. Ms. Lee? Ms. Lee, aye. Mrs. Lowy? Aye. Mrs. Lowy, aye. Ms. McCullum? Ms. McCullum, aye. Mr. Moran? Aye. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Nunnally? No. Mr. Nunnally, no. Mr. Owens? Aye. Mr. Owens, aye. Mr. Pastor? Aye. Mr. Pastor, aye. Ms. Pingree? Aye. Ms. Pingree, aye. Mr. Price? Aye. Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Quigley? Mr. Quigley, aye. Mrs. Roby? Mrs. Roby, no. Mr. Rogers? No. Mr. Rogers, no. Mr. Rooney? Mr. Rooney, no. Ms. Roby-Allard? Ms. Roby-Allard, aye. Mr. Ryan? Mr. Ryan, aye. Mr. Schiff? Mr. Schiff, aye. Mr. Serrano? Mr. Serrano, aye. Mr. Simpson? Mr. Simpson, no. Mr. Stewart? Mr. Stewart, no. Mr. Valadeo? Mr. Valadeo, no. Mr. Visklosky? Mr. Visklosky, aye. Ms. Wasserman Schultz? Ms. Wasserman Schultz, aye. Mr. Wolf? Mr. Wolf, no. Mr. Womack? Mr. Womack, no. Mr. Yoder? Mr. Yoder, no.
Are there members who wish to be recorded? Ms. Quare? It doesn't show.
Mr. Cuellar, aye.
Mr. Graves?
Mr. Graves, no.
Are there members who wish to be recorded or to change their vote? Clerk will tally. While the clerk is tallying, we have, I think, around 6 or 7 further amendments. And we have to finish this bill today. So I would hope that we could keep our comments as abbreviated as possible. And I know with the talent that's in this room, that is an achievable goal. On this vote, yeas are 22, the nays are 28. Amendment's not agreed to. Ms. McCollum.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I am very pleased to be offering this amendment with Mr. Price, Mr. Quigley.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Chapter.
Amendment offered by Ms. McCollum. Page 5, strike the first proviso and insert the following, and conform the committee report on page 8, provided further that projects eligible for funding provided under this heading shall
Without
include...
objection, the reading is dispensed with. The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment strikes new language in this bill that limits the types of transportation projects eligible for the National Infrastructure Grants, better known as Tiger Grants. This amendment inserts language from the FY 2014 Omnibus Bill. So it goes to a bill that overwhelming majority of us passed, and it would maintain the intention of the open nature of Tiger Grants. The new language in the bill before us today only permits roads, bridge, and freight and rail improvement projects to be eligible for these grants. Now, these are all noble projects, projects that I support. However, that means that passenger rail, public transportation would suddenly be excluded, not eligible for this popular program. Since its creation in 2009, eligibility for Tiger Grants has been broad and it's been open so that they can be used for regionally specific projects that might not fit in a normal formula grant area. And it's worked. And here's the proof. The Department of Transportation has awarded Tiger Grants to 271 projects since 2009. Projects as variable as decrepit bridges, adding managed lanes for bus rapid transit, and safety improvements. In my district, a Tiger Grant helped rehabilitate historic Union Depot and turn it into a multimodal transportation station for Amtrak, bus lines, and soon light rail, probably similar to the multimodal station in Iowa that also received a grant. The Department of Transportation received 797 applications for the 6th round of Tiger Grants, which just closed a few weeks ago. We should not, I repeat, we should not be putting new restrictions on an already successful program. This program isn't broken, it works, so what are we trying to fix? In fact, maybe we're trying to kill it through this new language that's been added. Now, I'm not offering this amendment to attack funding for roads and bridges. As I said clearly, these are good projects. But I am supporting roads and bridges and public transit opportunities with the language that I would like to have us go back to. Local elected officials, they know what their communities needs, whether it's a wider road, a street with safety improvements, or a light light rail train. They know what's best. We should be protecting local government's ability to use Tiger Grants for what their community needs, not what this community thinks they need. So my Republican colleagues and my Democratic colleagues often say to one another, our local units of government and others on the ground know what their communities need better than a group of people in Washington, D.C. So I would like to reinstate the language from the omnibus bill in 2014 so that we can continue this. My amendment, to be clear, does not require any offsets. My amendment simply maintains Tiger's flexibility to insert eligible language from the FY14 omnibus bill, which, as I said, the majority of you supported in January. I hope you consider supporting this amendment, flexibility, and local control.
Chairman Latham.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I rise in opposition to the amendment. Let me just clarify a couple things here. The National Infrastructure Investment is Mr. Quigley, it's what it's always been called. The Tiger name came out of somebody dreamed it up down at the department, but technically it's always the same. It's the same name it always has been. And I think there's some kind of a misunderstanding, like we're not funding some of these things. We got $3 billion for community development block grants, over $40 billion for highways, roads, bridges, $10 billion for transit in the bill. So it's not like we're not funding these things and keeping those jobs here. But this account was part of the stimulus, and it was meant to be a one-time thing that was aimed at addressing the complicated intermodal projects where there wasn't one clear line of program funding like ports, rail, seaway, and road projects, or projects that were of such national and regional significance that you couldn't expect one lone member to secure the funding. Instead, the administration has used a significant portion of these funds to do transit stations, sidewalks, streetscaping, and recreation paths. Sidewalks, paths, bus stops, and trails are eligible under the regular highway and transit accounts, and we don't need a special program. And let me stress, bike paths, pedestrian trails, sidewalks, streetscaping, and transit projects are all still funded in this bill. There's $40 billion set aside for Title 23 funds and more than $10 billion of the Title 49 funds for states and localities to undertake various transportation projects. And if you look at Map 21, the states now have the flexibility to use those funds as they would like, and that is a very important component, I think, and it should address a lot of the gentlelady's concerns. These projects that she's talking about aren't complicated. They don't address the congestion problems we have in this country. The language and the national or the Tiger grants keeps DOT focused, and that's the key to it, is focus on solving truly national and regional problems by getting unique projects off the ground. And looking at some of the 2014 awards compared to the language in to the bill, you'd see that a lot of those projects would still be eligible, like a port project in Eastport, Maine, for berthing space for larger vessels and Navy ships, upgrading a freight rail bridge in Greene County, Indiana, improving rail corridors in South Florida to better move freight and passenger traffic, improvements to the rail infrastructure in the inland port of Tucson, Arizona, not too far from the dry land of Phoenix, but replacement of 2 weight-restricted bridges in north-central Arkansas, improvements to the state-owned rail in western Oklahoma, and improved freight and crude oil transport. These would all still be funded with the language that we have. And we're not shutting down the Tiger grants or national infrastructure investments. We're trying to, again, focus the department's attention on, and the resources on truly national and regional transportation problems. And
Mr. Chairman,
for
would
that,
the gentleman yield for a point of clarification?
Sure.
I understand clearly what you're saying,
right.
But I also want to be clear in my understanding. For example, we are both familiar with Interstate 94, which runs through my district. So are you saying with the removal of the language that's changed with the Tiger grants, that the light rail gateway trail could still apply for a Tiger grant, because that's been our region's decision? So my understanding is that you're saying that light rail would still be eligible for these grants?
If it were a project of regional and national significance, huh?
No.
Oh, it'd be eligible as a new start, right?
But it would not be eligible for a Tiger. So I just want to make sure that point of clarification. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
What we're trying to do is focus the department on projects like there was stated in the authorization to begin with, of national and regional significance. Okay, and you still have access to those funds through the normal channel, and the states and governors now have a lot more flexibility to prioritize that money under MAP 21 than they ever used to. So I would just urge a no vote on the amendment for those reasons.
Mr. Quigley.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, Mr. Pastor.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in support of the amendment. I believe that the limited language is unnecessary. We all know that in these Tiger grants, we've had, and I know that I've had colleagues from both sides ask for letters of support. And I think by having the limiting language, what it does, then it takes away the flexibility where the local jurisdictions are not able to make application as to their needs. And so I disagree with this idea that we need to focus because sometimes not all knowledge is here in D.C. and with this committee, and I think the flexibility should be left to the local jurisdictions so that then as members of this Congress, both Democrats and Republicans, we can write the letters of support. As long as we gave away our responsibility of directing congressional programs, this is the only method that we have where we might influence projects to be able to come to our particular district or to our particular state or region. And so I support the amendment because I believe that the language is too limiting and we ought to restore the flexibility that we started with and continue funding programs in that manner.
Mr. Quigley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the ranking member's remarks about titles and what we call things. Respectfully, you say tomato, I say tomato. You say national infrastructure investments, I say tiger. But if it meows like a kitten, it's still a kitten.
It's not a new thing.
I understand. The problem here is the world is changing. Vehicle miles driven are down. Use of bikes have gone up. And correspondingly, pedestrian deaths have gone up dramatically, and deaths through vehicle accidents have gone down. And we need to fund that which is appropriate for a changing world, particularly if we're concerned about climate change and problems with the environment. Getting people out of cars, getting them into light rail, getting them onto bikes is probably a really good thing. I appreciate the author of this amendment, and I support it.
Mr. Price.
I would think we'd be able to come together in support of this amendment. It costs nothing. It simply has to do with the eligibility for a program, the hallmark of which has been its flexibility. The project in my own district has involved a transportation hub. It involves public transit, it involves high-speed rail, it involves buses. Why would we want to remove that flexibility? That's the whole purpose of the program, to let us fund these multimodal projects, or at least that's a major purpose of the program. Why would we want to eliminate public transit and passenger rail from Tiger funding? I can't imagine any good reason for that. I would hope we'd restore the flexibility that this program has been known for.
Without objection, Ms. McCollum is recognized. A minute to close.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I urge support of this amendment. The Tiger Grant program works, and it doesn't need to be amended to restrict program eligibility as the current bill will do. Again, my amendment simply strikes new language, restrictive language, and it replaces the eligibility language from the FY14 omnibus bill. By all of us supporting inclusive language, we will all be able to continue to enable local governments and transportation authorities to apply for Tiger grants accordingly based on what their communities need, what their communities want. We shouldn't be undermining a successful program. We should be supporting anything that encourages local ownership and innovation, and so I urge a yes support.
The question is on the McCollum amendment. All in favor will say aye.
Aye.
All opposed will say no. No. The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
I request a recorded vote.
Recorded vote is requested. A sufficient number supporting. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Adderholt. Mr. Adderholt, no. Mr. Amadei. Mr. Amadei, no. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop, aye. Mr. Calvert. Mr. Calvert, no. Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter, no. Mr. Cole. Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Crenshaw. Mr. Cuellar. Mr. Cuellar, aye. Mr. Culberson. Mr. Culberson, no. Ms. DeLauro. Ms. DeLauro, aye. Mr. Dent. Mr. Dent, no. Mr. Diaz-Balart. Mr. Diaz-Balart, no. Mr. Farr. Mr. Farr, aye. Mr. Fatah. Mr. Fatah, aye. Mr. Fleischman. Mr. Fleischman, no. Mr. Fortenberry. Mr. Fortenberry, no. Mr. Feelinghuisen. Mr. Feelinghuisen, no. Ms. Granger. Ms. Granger, no. Mr. Graves. Mr. Graves, no. Dr. Harris. Dr. Harris, no. Ms. Ferrera-Butler. Ms. Ferrera-Butler, no. Mr. Honda. Mr. Honda, aye. Mr. Joyce. Mr. Joyce, no. Ms. Capter. Ms. Capter, aye. Mr. Kingston. Mr. Latham.
No.
Mr. Latham, no. Ms. Lee. Ms. Lee, aye. Mrs. Lowy. Mrs. Lowy, aye. Ms. McCullum. Ms. McCullum, aye. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Nunnally. Mr. Nunnally, no. Mr. Owens. Mr. Owens, aye. Mr. Pastor. Mr. Pastor, aye. Ms. Pingree. Ms. Pingree, aye. Mr. Price. Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Quigley. Mr. Quigley, aye. Mrs. Roby. Mrs. Roby, no. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers, no. Mr. Rooney. Mr. Rooney, no. Ms. Robo-Allard. Ms. Robo-Allard, aye. Mr. Ryan. Mr. Ryan, aye. Mr. Schiff. Mr. Schiff, aye. Mr. Serrano. Mr. Serrano, aye. Mr. Simpson. Mr. Simpson, no. Mr. Stewart. Mr. Stewart, no. Mr. Valadeo. Mr. Valadeo, no. Mr. Visklosky. Mr. Visklosky, aye. Ms. Wasserman Schultz. Ms. Wasserman Schultz, aye. Mr. Wolf. Mr. Wolf, no. Mr. Womack. Mr. Womack, no. Mr. Yoder. Mr. Yoder, no.
Are there members who wish to be recorded?
Crenshaw.
Mr. Crenshaw.
Mr. Crenshaw, no.
Any member wish to change their vote? If not, the clerk will tally. On this vote, the yeas are 22, the nays are 28. The amendment is not agreed to. Mr. Quigley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will read.
Amendment offered by Mr. Quigley.
Dispense with the reading.
Reading is dispensed with, without objection, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman, in the interest of time and certain realities, I'm intending to offer and withdraw this amendment. Mr. Chairman, as well I understand the committee's budgetary constraints, the fact is, despite this year's low allocation, this committee still has the power to preserve and improve affordable housing properties today without an increase in HUD's annual appropriation needs. We can do this simply by lifting the current cap on rental assistance demonstration program. In these difficult budgetary times, the RAD program is key to the betterment of our public housing communities and the answer to many challenges housing authorities face in their mission to create and preserve affordable housing. Allowing public housing authorities to convert their public housing units to project-based vouchers or rental assistance contracts is a cost-effective way to recapitalize their public housing portfolio, tapping into outside sources of capital to make important improvements. My amendment would lift the current rental assistance demonstration program cap from an arbitrary 60,000 to 250,000 units. By increasing the statutory cap on units that can convert under RAD, the Chicago Housing Authority, for example, as well as the nearly 300 public housing agencies with applications on the waitlist, can participate in RAD. Across the country, some 7,000 properties in the public housing program, PHAs, are largely limited to the $1.8 billion that Congress provides to the public housing capital funds to make repairs. This represents approximately 7% of the estimated backlog of capital needs in the public housing program. The current 60,000 unit cap is the biggest barrier to preserving and improving hundreds of thousands of additional units at no cost. HUD has a tremendous demand for RAD. PHAs and owners have submitted applications representing 180,000 units, or 15% of the nation's public housing stock. Under the existing cap, 2/3 of these properties cannot be served. This includes vital units in my district. The cost of this inaction is significant. Conservatively, because HUD cannot process these applications through RAD without congressional action, $2.7 billion in non-federal cap is sitting on the sideline, unable to improve the conditions of properties, preserve and enhance the rights of residents, and create nearly 50,000 jobs. Mr. Chairman, if Congress gives the RAD program the support it needs to expand, housing authorities will be able to provide low-income families with the opportunities and homes they deserve.
Chairman Latham.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I must rise to oppose the amendment, as this really is something that should be left to the authorizers. We also have a lot of outstanding questions on the proposal to expand the program, including the long-term liabilities, that this would shift to the project-based rental assistance account. And also, you'd be interested to know the ranking member of the Financial Services Committee, Ms. Waters from Los Angeles, has asked the committee and written a letter asking the committee not to lift the cap on the RAD program. The authorizers clearly have a lot of work to do yet, and it would be premature and inappropriate to lift the cap at this time or in this bill. So anyway, with that, I would oppose the amendment, and I yield back.
Is there further discussion? Ms. Robel-Eller?
I understand the amendment is going to be withdrawn, but I think this is a very important issue that needs to be highlighted. You know, our nation's public housing continues to deteriorate due to the chronic capital underfunding it has been experiencing. And this is resulting in deteriorating living conditions and greater risks from safety hazards for more than 1 million families who live in public housing, many of whom are elderly and disabled. The bill before us that we are debating today makes matters worse by cutting funding for the Public Housing Capital Fund to the lowest level since the 1980s. This makes the provisions of this amendment even more critical. Public housing agencies across the country are eager to participate in the RAD program because it would allow them to convert the units they own from traditional public housing subsidies to project-based funding, which would enable them to utilize more stable and predictable funding streams, apply for low-income housing tax credits, and other sources of funding to help them ensure the health and safety of current public house tenants and to help our housing authorities fix currently vacant units that are currently uninhabitable at a time when there is great need for housing. So by raising the 60,000 cap would be critical to allowing these housing units to be fixed and made available for additional tenants. This includes the Los Angeles County issue, which owns 1,843 units for low-income families and seniors, which have approximately $71 million in deferred maintenance and construction needs. Yet LA County's application continues to languish on the RAD waiting list due to the cap. So I understand that this is a reauthorizing issue, and I'm hoping that we'll be able to work with the authorizing committee to address this very critical need. And I thank my colleague for raising this issue.
Mr. Quigley is recognized to close.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I do appreciate the opportunity to make this case and to work on this issue, because I do think in the end it will help us provide more housing at no additional cost to the HUD Appropriation Fund. And I do respect the fact that we're not authorizers. I do have a tip, though, for folks who want to avoid that. Just include the words truck weight in your amendment, and it'll find some way to avoid problems of authorizing. But, Mr. Chairman, with all due respect, I do withdraw it.
Are there further amendments? Mr. Honda.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will read.
Amendment offered by Mr. Honda.
Reading.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment is simple. It increases the funding for the Federal Transit Administration's capital investment grants by $809 million to the level requested by the President to $2.5 billion. Through the Capital Investment Grants Program, commonly known as the New Starts, Small Starts, and Core Capacity Programs, FTA partners with transit agencies around the nation that are undertaking major new projects or extensions to increase the capacity of the nation's transit network and meet ridership demands. These local agencies go through a rigorous multi-year, multi-step competitive review by FTA. Prior to being approved for funding, each project must receive an acceptable rating under a set of criteria defined by law that evaluate project merit and local financial commitment. When they are approved, the local sponsors sign full funding grant agreements with FTA. At that point, they are counting on the federal government to live up to its end of the agreement in order to complete their project on time. Unfortunately, the funding level in the bill before us today has those local sponsors worried that they will not receive all the funding they are scheduled to receive in fiscal year 2015. And I expect the chairman will say that this bill includes enough funding to fully fund the existing New Starts full funding grant agreements, and that is probably true. But there are several projects that were recommended for funding in the President's FY14 budget that have not received a construction grant agreement but expects to soon. And there are other new and small starts projects that have not been previously recommended for funding but expect to be ready for construction grant agreement during FY15. If we don't increase the funding level for the capital investment grants, FTA will be left with two options, and both of them are bad. Either they can refuse to approve any new projects, which will leave significant transit needs around the country unmet, or they will need to reduce the funding that each of the current full funding grant agreements receive in order to accommodate the new projects. Neither of these is the right direction for our country. We need to finish the projects we have started on time. This will keep people employed and save taxpayer dollars. And we need to get moving on new projects that will help Americans get to where they need to go, improve our environment and quality of life, and promote economic growth. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment.
Chairman Latham.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I must rise to oppose the amendment. The amendment proposes to increase funding without an offset, thus causing the bill to exceed our 302B allocation. I urge a no vote.
Ms. Lee.
I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in strong support of this amendment. Thank Mr. Honda for offering it, and I'm proud to co-sponsor it. It basically just brings funding for the Capital Investment Grants Program, known as Smart Starts, New Starts, up to the administration's requested funding level. That's all it does, the administration's request. The New Starts and Small Starts program provides critical support for rail, bus, rapid transit, streetcar, and ferry projects, and has been proven effective in communities throughout the country. In my own district, for example, these funds have been put to use in the planning and construction of AC Transit's bus rapid transit project. This project, like all Smart Starts and New Starts projects, they're the result of regional planning processes that are very rigorous. They meet the high standards set out by this program to minimize costs. They leverage local funding and provide economic and environmental benefits to the areas that it affects. Through this program, again, in my district, AC Transit will be able to better serve low-income and transit-reliant populations. This bus service really is the lifeline of my community, many communities. They connect people to centers of education and commerce and hospitals and emergency rooms, while at the same time creating new jobs and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. It's a program that has received extensive congressional input to ensure its effectiveness, and I encourage my colleagues to approve this amendment and return funding to this important program, again, just basically to the administration's request.
Mr. Hunt is recognized to close.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In closing, I'll just remind my colleagues that capital transit investments yield significant benefits. Every $1 billion of federal investment in public transportation supports more than 37,500 jobs. Every $1 billion of federal investment in public transit generates an estimated $3.5 billion in economic activity. Each year, 4 billion gallons of gasoline are saved and 37 million metric tons of carbon dioxide emissions are avoided because of public transit. Transit ridership is at its highest level in 50 years and demand is growing. We need to invest in our transit systems of the future, which is why we need to fund the capital improvement grants at $2.5 billion for FY15. And I urge my colleagues to support my amendment.
The question is on the Honda amendment. All in favor will say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. No. The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
As for recorded, bro. I ask for recorded vote.
A sufficient number. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Adderholt. No. Mr. Adderholt, no. Mr. Amadei. Mr. Amadei, no. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop, aye. Mr. Calvert. Mr. Calvert, no. Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter, no. Mr. Cole. Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Crenshaw. Mr. Crenshaw, no. Mr. Cuellar. Mr. Cuellar, aye. Mr. Culberson. Mr. Culberson, no. Ms. DeLauro. Ms. DeLauro. Ms. DeLauro, aye. Mr. Dent. Mr. Dent, no. Mr. Diaz-Balart. Mr. Farr.
Aye.
Mr. Farr, aye. Mr. Fatah.
Aye.
Mr. Fatah, aye. Mr. Fleischman. No. Mr. Fleischman, no. Mr. Fortenberry. Mr. Fortenberry, no. Mr. Frelinghuysen. No. Mr. Frelinghuysen, no. Ms. Granger. No. Ms. Granger, no. Mr. Graves. Dr. Harris. Ms. Herrera Butler. No. Ms. Herrera Butler, no. Mr. Honda. Mr. Honda. Mr. Honda, aye. Mr. Joyce. Mr. Joyce, no. Ms. Capter. Ms. Capter, aye. Mr. Kingston. Mr. Latham. No. Mr. Latham, no. Ms. Lee. Ms. Lee, aye. Mrs. Lowy. Aye. Mrs. Lowy, aye. Ms. McCollum. Ms. McCollum, aye. Mr. Moran. Mr. Nunnally. Mr. Nunnally. No. Mr. Nunnally, no. Mr. Owens. Mr. Owens, aye. Mr. Pastor. Aye. Mr. Pastor, aye. Ms. Pingree. Aye. Ms. Pingree, aye. Mr. Price. Aye. Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Quigley. Aye. Mr. Quigley, aye. Mrs. Roby. Mrs. Roby, no. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers, no. Mr. Rooney. Mr. Rooney, no. Ms. Robo-Allard. Ms. Robo-Allard, aye. Mr. Ryan. Mr. Ryan, aye. Mr. Schiff. Mr. Schiff, aye. Mr. Serrano. Mr. Serrano, aye. Mr. Simpson. Mr. Simpson, no. Mr. Stewart. Mr. Stewart, no. Mr. Valadeo. Mr. Valadeo, no. Mr. Visclosky. Mr. Visclosky, aye. Ms. Wasserman Schultz. Ms. Wasserman Schultz, aye. Mr. Wolf. Mr. Wolf, no. Mr. Womack. Mr. Womack, no. Mr. Yoder.
Are there members who wish to be recorded?
Diaz-Balart.
Mr. Diaz-Balart.
Gentleman's not recorded.
Mr. Graves. Mr. Harris. Mr. Yoder? No. Anyone wish to be recognized or to change their vote? Clerk will tally. While the clerk's tallying, we've got a vote on the floor now. So we will do one more amendment and then go vote and come right directly back. And we should have no more than 2 or 3 amendments when we come back. But I urge you to return promptly so we can finish this bill.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that the vote used to defeat the last amendment be used to defeat future amendments. Then we can be done.
I think the gentleman's still giddy. On this vote, the yeas are 21, the nays are 28. The amendment is not agreed to. Mr. Fatah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will read.
Amendment offered by Mr. Fatah, page Page 48 after line
Without
9.
objection, the reading is dismissed
Avoid the
with the gentleman's
reading of the
recommendation.
amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On behalf of myself and Mr. Dent from the state of Pennsylvania, last July we lost a former member of this committee, Congressman Bill Gray, died. He served not only on the Appropriations Committee but as chair of the Budget Committee and went on to be whip in the House. We offer this amendment, which I intend to withdraw, but I offer this to name a train station that's in my district after the late congressman. I'm sure there's not one member of this committee that would object, but we want to go through the appropriate procedures and consult with the authorizing committee. But I offer this. I think it would be appropriate. When he was a member of this committee, he was credited with bringing to this station a revitalization project that made it one of the premier stations in the country. So we offer this at this time, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you for allowing me to make this case, and I'll yield at this point.
Mr. Dent.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased to co-author this amendment with my friend, Mr. Fattah. Bill Gray obviously was a very distinguished member of this committee, a member of the Democratic leadership, I guess majority whip, first African American, I believe, in leadership. He had served his city, his community, his commonwealth, and his country with great distinction, not just in Congress but outside of Congress. And as has been stated, just an extraordinary human being. We're so sad to lose him. And as one who travels to 30th Street Station on a regular occasion, I'll be very proud and pleased to see his name atop that station. I think many of my colleagues would as well. So,
Chairman Latham.
Appreciate gentlemen's leadership.
I assume the gentleman is going to withdraw the amendment, correct?
I am, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. And it's some concerns we have, obviously, with authorizing and going, but...
I'm going to check with Chairman Schuster and get appropriate approval.
That would be the appropriate way. So,
all right.
Thank you very much.
I would like to withdraw the amendment.
Amendment is withdrawn. Are there further amendments? Mr. Schiff.
Mr. Chairman, I think I can be fairly quick. I have two remaining amendments. One that I think has been agreed to, and the other I don't intend to ask for a recorded vote. The first is amendment number 3.
Clerk will read.
Amendment offered by Mr. Schiff. In the report, page 74, in the paragraph titled Administrative Fees.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with. The gentleman is recognized.
I just want to thank Chairman Latham for the report language he has proposed and the very quick work on this. I look forward to working with him and with the authorizing committee to see if we can resolve the portability of the voucher issue.
The gentleman will yield. We'll accept the amendment.
Thank you. I yield.
Without objection, the amendment is agreed to. Can this be done briefly?
Yes, it can.
Mr. Schiff.
Mr. Chairman,
amendment offered by Mr. Schiff.
Mr. Chairman, I offer this amendment with Representative McCollum to increase funding for home by $900 million.
Clerk will read.
Amendment offered by Mr. Schiff, page 96, line 16, increase the dollar amount by $900 million.
Mr. Chairman, the amendment before us addresses the underfunding of HUD's home program. Home provides grants to state and local governments to produce affordable housing for low-income families. It's a successful program with a proven track record. In the last 20 years, the program has produced more than 1.1 million affordable homes. Each home dollar leverages an additional $4 in public and private resources and enables affordable housing developers to build in our communities. It's a vital resource. In 2012, over 18 million households spent more than half of their income on housing, and more than 1 in 4 working families shoulders a severe housing cost burden, and I would urge us to restore these funds.
Chairman Latham.
Back.
Would have to oppose the amendment. There's no offset, and it would exceed our allocation. So, urge a no vote.
Gentlemen, wish to be heard?
I would, Representative McCollum and I would urge your support, and I will yield back.
Question is on the Schiff amendment. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed say no. No. No seem to have it. The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. There is 8 minutes left on the floor, and we've only got 2, I hope, quick amendments. Can we do, Mr. Price, is yours a fairly brief one? All right, you're recognized.
Mr. Chairman, this is a...
Clerk will report.
Amendment offered by Mr. Price.
The reading be suspended.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with.
Quite simply, Mr. Chairman, this is a $1 million amendment. It is offset, and it proposes to do what we've done many times before, namely to extend the life of the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness. It would be premature to let the work of this council expire. The council has actually done very good work, and in many areas we're seeing the coming online of sufficient units, sufficient properties to remedy our homelessness and to at least make it possible to, with the veterans population and with the chronic homeless population, to see how we might deal with this stubborn long-term issue. But we're not done with that job yet, and in particular, when you look at the homeless population that remains, it's mainly women, it's mainly children. And so the work of the Interagency Council isn't done. It's premature to let it expire. So why would we want to let this program die, let this work stop? We've extended the program 10 times for good reason, and I'm proud that we've made the progress we have, especially with homeless veterans. But the average family now experiencing homelessness is headed by a single mother in her late 20s with 2 children, at least one of whom is under the age of 6. More than 80% of these mothers have experienced domestic violence in their lifetime. So I ask colleagues, let's do what we've done before. Let's continue this, particularly when you look at the homeless population that remains. This is something we simply can't turn our backs on. I'll be happy to yield.
If the gentleman would accept a secondary amendment that takes out reinstates the date of the ending of this. Right now, you're making it a permanent law.
Right.
Okay. If you'll take that out, if you allow me to make an amendment, second amendment, we'll accept the amendment otherwise.
We will have.
But I'm not going to make it permanent.
We will have to work together on the authorization side of this. But yes, I'll accept that as a friendly amendment.
The gentleman offers a secondary amendment.
Right. To strike after provided at the bottom of the Price amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Latham to the amendment by Mr. Price. Strike the last proviso.
Without objection, the amendment is agreed to.
And we would accept your amendment as amended.
I thank the gentleman. I move acceptance.
Without objection, the amendment as amendment is agreed to. Ms. Pingree, do you plan to offer your amendment?
Yes.
Is it lengthy?
Yes. I can try to be brief.
We've only got 4.5 minutes left. We've got 2 or 3 amendments left, so we will recess and be right back here.
Good job, Chairman.
Special sources. Yeah, I will definitely. I'm not going to. Wait.
I never had this finger on. I never did this number out, and I had it in my hand, and it was keep calling. I said, "Come on this morning." So yeah, this is what I just happened that once had this urge to pick it up.
Bizarre.
Okay, so we really are doing something. That's all I'm saying.
That's cute.
My baby brother. No, 30 seconds.
No, but I can't remember the fact where I was born, but I was born in a hospital. Was there a hospital called Methodist? I think I was born in Methodist. I'm sorry, do you mind?
Oh, come
So I
on
definitely-
back.
Thank you, thank you. Oh, really? In labor? Did they keep you being underweight? Did you Oh, yeah. They used to do that all the time. Hair syrup and evaporated milk. Yeah, can you imagine? Given what we know today, it probably kept you from gaining weight. Yeah, and it set up your genes, sent all the
Committee will be in order. Are there further amendments? Ms. Pingree.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. All right, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will read.
Amendment offered by Ms. Pingree, page 112, line 13, increase the dollar amount by $50 million. Page 112, line 15, increase the dollar amount by $15 million.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you very much. So this amendment would bring the funding back to the request for the Lead Hazard Control and Healthy Homes program. I don't think I have to go into great detail about the issues around lead, paint, and hazards in our homes. It's an issue that all of us have dealt with. It's a program that's been funded in the past, but currently in this particular bill has a 36% cut. Just a little background from my state. As you know, I come from Maine. We have some of the oldest housing stock in the nation, and our Department of Environmental Quality estimates that more than half the homes in our state have lead paint. True in so many other people's states. In 2012, the CDC redefined the level at which children are considered to have too much lead in their blood, which means that there was an increase in the number of children considered to have too much lead in their bodies from 100,000 to more than 535,000. Indoor pollution and other hazards are increasingly a problem. The average child, which came as a surprise to me, spends 90% of their time indoors. We should be doing something about that anyway. But many of them are exposed to lead paint and other household hazards. And I think most of us know that that is a severe issue for child development. It is associated with decreased academic performance, cognition, and other behavioral problems. So lead is the primary focus of this problem, but I'm also pleased that it deals with issues around carbon monoxide, radon, mold, and other toxins that are also found along with lead in the homes. And it assists with remediation. HUD estimates that at the requested level of $120 million, this will result in 11,000 housing units that will be able to be made safe nationwide. I think this is a critically important program. I think that we should fund it at the level of $120 million, and I think that it's one of those things that is critically important to our children and their development, and I ask for your support in this amendment.
Chairman Latham.
I thank the gentlewoman for the amendment. I'm going to have to oppose it because it does blow our allocation, our 302B allocation. We are at $70 million in the bill for this account. I know it's very important to a lot of folks, and hopefully we could find a proper offset. We could work on it, but at this point I have to oppose it.
Gentlelady is recognized to close. Ms. Lloyd.
Thank you very much, but I must rise in strong support of this amendment. Since this program was started in 1992, over 195,000 homes have been made lead safe. During that period, the prevalence of elevated lead levels in children has fallen from over 7% in 1997 to under 1% in 2012. Nevertheless, there remains a great deal more to be done. Elevated blood lead levels are associated with decreased academic performance, cognition, and behavioral problems. In fact, 10% of juvenile delinquency is attributed to lead poisoning. A 2008 study estimates that lead poisoning generates $60 billion in costs to society. While lead is the focus of this program, we also need to devote some resources to other household toxins. Carbon monoxide, radon, mold are often found alongside lead in these homes. In many of these homes, the building envelope has deteriorated, causes an increase in exposure to lead and mold. The Healthy Homes funding allows for the whole home to be remediated at once, returns the home to a safe and sanitary condition. I strongly support the amendment, and I yield back.
Gentlelady is recognized to close.
In closing, I just want to check again with the Chair, Mr. Latham. Now, you suggested that perhaps you'd be willing to work on finding an offset. If that's possible, I am willing to withdraw. Otherwise, I'd like to call for a vote.
I would be more than willing to work with the gentlewoman on this account. I know how important it is. This is a result of the pressure we have in the bill elsewhere. This is very important, but if we can find some other way of doing it, I'd be more than happy to work with
Great. Well, I certainly appreciate your offer to do that, and in that case, I will withdraw the amendment and look forward to working with you.
The amendment is withdrawn. Are there further amendments? Ms. DeLauro.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will read.
Amendment offered by Ms. DeLauro. At the end of the bill, insert the following.
Ask that unanimous consent.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with. The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman, the amendment at the desk would raise the minimum wage over 3 years to $10.10 per hour and then index the wage to inflation. What this means is that it would be a raise for at least 25 million workers nationwide, 2/3 of them who are women. It would lift between 1 million and 4.5 million Americans out of poverty. It would mean $22 billion in increased economic activity for businesses and an additional 85,000 jobs all over the country. And more importantly than anything else, it's the right thing to do. At a time of great need across America, we know that the minimum wage has fallen far below the rise of cost of living. Minimum wage in America used to be equal to about half of average wages. Today it's at $7.25 an hour, barely a third. At that rate, you have a year of full-time work comes out to about $14,500 a year. For a mom and 2 kids, that's over $3,000 below the poverty line. I might add that the average age of minimum wage workers is 35. And I think we can concur that no one who works full-time should have to raise their family in poverty. This is not and should not be a partisan issue. In 2006, this Appropriations Committee adopted in a bipartisan way an increase in the minimum wage. And I might add at the time, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle who supported this effort were Mrs. Emerson, Mr. LaHood, Mr. Sherwood, Mr. Simpson, who still sits on the committee, Mr. Sweeney, Mr. Walsh, and Mr. Young. There are also 36 Republicans who voted to increase the minimum wage in 2007. They're still serving in the Congress. And 26 Republicans signed a letter on July 12, 2006, urging the minority leader, Mr. Boehner, to provide a substantial increase in the minimum wage. And quite frankly, it's from that letter that we get the commentary that no one working full-time should have to live in poverty. In 2007, President Bush signed into law the last minimum wage increase. Americans support raising the minimum wage to $10.10 an hour by a 4-to-1 margin. It includes 3 out of 5 Republicans, 4 out of 5 independents. Nation's small businesses are supportive. According to Small Business Majority, over 2/3 of our small business owners support increasing the minimum wage and adjusting it annually to reflect the cost of living. And they know that raising the minimum wage means more demand for their products and services. In fact, 85% of small businesses surveyed already pay more than the minimum. And I think that we all know that in order for us to have economic growth, we have to, that demand is what's critical. Businesses are not going to expand, hire, or do anything else unless people are prepared to buy their products. It also is note for some who might be interested that the taxpayer dollars saved in SNAP spending over the 10-year minimum wage increase would be $46 billion. And I know some folks here have some concern about SNAP funds. Especially in this tough economy, we have a responsibility to do right by working families. A long overdue raise in the minimum wage will help ensure that workers can make a decent paid work for a hard day's work. And I urge all of my colleagues to support the amendment.
I can't believe the gentlelady offered this amendment at this last minute. We only received it here, 5 minutes ago? And we've had a good debate here, a positive debate on the merits of this bill and the amendments that's been offered. But to drop this very partisan amendment at the very last minute.
Not a partisan amendment.
Is
not a partisan amendment at all, Mr. Chairman.
Excuse me.
It was offered in this
Excuse
by
me.
Mr. Hoyer.
The lady does not have the floor. But to offer this amendment at this last minute to disrupt this committee's good work on this bill without notice to anyone is abhorrent. Nevertheless, we'll consider it.
Thank you very much,
Chairman Latham.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for the recognition. Obviously, I rise in opposition. It's, and like the Chairman said just a few hours ago, this bill, the whole process was congenial and a bipartisan effort going on, and we've moved, worked to eliminate riders in this bill, and the greatest opposition is centered around where and for what programs money was going to be spent. This amendment unravels months of bipartisan collegial hard work, and this amendment would bring this bill to a halt. It would be dead if, in fact, this were to be adopted. And what that would affect would be the highway funding, transit funding, aviation funds, all would be done. Housing, homeless, development funds, everything would be done if the gentlelady's amendment were adopted. This amendment should be considered outside of the appropriations process in the Committee of Jurisdiction and brought to the House under regular order, just like we're trying to do with this committee. We're appropriators. Let's stick to the matters of our jurisdiction. I'm very, very disappointed that this amendment is being offered at this point, and I certainly would ask for a no vote.
The question is on the amendment. All in favor say aye.
Chairman, I have amendment.
All opposed say no.
Mr. Chairman.
The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed.
I asked for a recorded vote.
Recorded votes requested.
And I was denied an opportunity to close, Mr. Chairman. That has never happened in this committee before.
Gentlelady does not have the floor. Clerk will call the roll.
For 1 minute, Mr. Chairman.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Adderholt. Mr. Adderholt, no. Mr. Amadei. Mr. Amadei, no. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop, aye. Mr. Calvert. Mr. Calvert, no. Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter, no. Mr. Cole. Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Crenshaw. Mr. Crenshaw, no. Mr. Cuellar. Mr. Cuellar, aye. Mr. Culberson. Mr. Culberson, no. Ms. DeLauro.
I and Mr. Hoyer introduced this amendment.
Ms. DeLauro, aye. Mr. Dent.
And
Mr. Dent, no. Mr. Diaz-Balart.
Gentlelady will cease and desist.
Mr. Diaz-Balart. Mr. Diaz-Balart, no. Mr. Farr? Mr. Farr, aye. Mr. Fatah? Mr. Fatah, aye. Mr. Fleischman? Mr. Fleischman, no. Mr. Fortenberry? Mr. Fortenberry, no. Mr. Frelinghuysen? Mr. Frelinghuysen, no. Ms. Granger? Ms. Granger, no. Mr. Graves? Mr. Graves, no. Dr. Harris? Dr. Harris, no. Ms. Herrera-Butler? Mr. Honda? Mr. Honda, aye. Mr. Joyce? Mr. Joyce, no. Ms. Capter? Ms. Capter? Ms. Capter? Mr. Kingston? Mr. Latham? Mr. Latham, no. Ms. Lee? Ms. Lee, aye. Mrs. Lowy? Mrs. Lowy, aye. Ms. McCullum? Ms. McCullum, aye. Mr. Moran? Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Nunnally? Mr. Nunnally, no. Mr. Owens? Mr. Owens, aye. Mr. Pastor? Mr. Pastor, aye. Ms. Pingree? Ms. Pingree, aye. Mr. Price? Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Quigley? Mr. Quigley, aye. Mrs. Roby? Mrs. Roby, no. Mr. Rogers?
No.
Mr. Rogers, no. Mr. Rooney? Mr. Rooney, no. Ms. Roby-Allard? Ms. Roby-Allard, aye. Mr. Ryan? Mr. Ryan, aye. Mr. Schiff? Mr. Schiff, aye. Mr. Serrano? Mr. Serrano, aye. Mr. Simpson? Mr. Simpson, no. Mr. Stewart? Mr. Stewart, no. Mr. Valadeo? Mr. Valadeo, no. Mr. Visklosky? Mr. Visklosky, aye. Ms. Wasserman-Schultz? Ms. Wasserman-Schultz, aye. Mr. Wolf? Mr. Wolf, no. Mr. Womack? Mr. Womack, no. Mr. Yoder? Mr. Yoder, no.
Are there members who wish to be recorded?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to be recorded.
Ms. Capter?
Yes, I'd like to be recorded as aye, please.
Ms. Capter, aye.
Are there members who wish to change their vote? Clerk will tally. On this vote, the yeas are 22, the nays are 27. The amendment is not agreed to. Are there further amendments? Hearing none, Mr. Chairman Wolf is recognized for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move to favorably report the Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development Appropriation Bill for fiscal year 2015 to the House.
On the Wolf motion, all in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, no.
No.
The motion is agreed to, and the recorded vote is requested. A sufficient number, the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Adderholt? Mr. Adderholt, aye. Mr. Amadei? Mr. Amadei, aye. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop, no. Mr. Calvert? Mr. Calvert, aye. Mr. Carter? Mr. Carter, aye. Mr. Cole? Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Crenshaw? Mr. Crenshaw, aye. Mr. Cuellar? Mr. Cuellar, no. Mr. Culberson? Mr. Culberson, aye. Ms. DeLauro?
Hell no.
Ms. DeLauro, no. Mr. Dent?
Aye.
Mr. Dent, aye. Mr. Diaz-Balart? Mr. Diaz-Balart, aye. Mr. Farr? Mr. Farr, no. Mr. Fatah? Mr. Fleischman? Mr. Fleischman, aye. Mr. Fortenberry? Mr. Fortenberry, aye. Mr. Frelinghuysen? Mr. Frelinghuysen, aye. Ms. Granger? Ms. Granger, aye. Mr. Graves? Mr. Graves, aye. Dr. Harris? Dr. Harris, aye. Ms. Herrera-Butler? Mr. Honda? Mr. Honda, no. Mr. Joyce? Mr. Joyce, aye. Ms. Capter?
No.
Ms. Capter, no. Mr. Kingston? Mr. Latham? Mr. Latham, aye. Ms. Lee? Ms. Lee, no. Mrs. Lowy?
No.
Mrs. Lowy, no. Ms. McCullum? Ms. McCullum, no. Mr. Moran? No. Mr. Moran, no. Mr. Nunnally?
No. Excuse me.
Mr. Nunnally, aye. Mr. Owens? No. Mr. Owens, no. Mr. Pastor?
Aye.
Mr. Pastor, aye. Ms. Pingree? No. Ms. Pingree, no. Mr. Price? No. Mr. Price, no. Mr. Quigley? Mr. Quigley, no. Mrs. Roby? Aye. Mrs. Roby, aye. Mr. Rogers? Mr. Rogers, aye. Mr. Rooney? Mr. Rooney, aye. Ms. Roby-Allard?
No.
Ms. Roby-Allard, no. Mr. Ryan? No. Mr. Ryan, no. Mr. Schiff? No. Mr. Schiff, no. Mr. Serrano? Mr. Serrano, no. Mr. Simpson? Mr. Simpson, aye. Mr. Stewart? Mr. Stewart, aye. Mr. Valadeo? Aye. Mr. Valadeo, aye. Mr. Visklosky? No. Mr. Visklosky, no. Ms. Wasserman Schultz? No. Ms. Wasserman Schultz, no. Mr. Wolf? Aye. Mr. Wolf, aye. Mr. Womack? Aye. Mr. Womack, aye. Mr. Yoder? Aye. Mr. Yoder, aye.
Are there members who are not recorded? Voted no. Mr. Fatah?
Mr. Fatah, no.
Or to change their vote? Clerk will tally. On this vote, the yeas are 28, the nays are 21. The motion is agreed to.
3 days.
3 days. I ask unanimous consent that the staff be given the authority to make technical and conforming changes to the items approved today. Without objection, so ordered. If there's no further business, the committee stands adjourned. Good job.
Thank you very much.